Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The city of Appler, in the year of our Lord 1488, was a jewel nestled in a valley of rolling hills, famous for its abundant apple orchards that stretched for miles, their blossoms painting the spring landscape in hues of pink and white. Its people were known for their jovial nature, their festivals vibrant with song and dance, and their cider sweet as nectar. Melissa, a woman of striking beauty and sharp wit, had found herself drawn into this seemingly idyllic world as the mistress of Lord Valerius, the city's benevolent, if somewhat self-absorbed ruler. Her chamber in Lord Valerius's sprawling manor was a testament to Appler's prosperity. Bright, airy, adorned with floral tapestries and windows that overlooked manicured gardens. Yet, despite the sunshine and the sweet scent of apple blossoms that drifted in, Melissa often felt an inexplicable chill. It was a subtle unease, a discordant note in Appler's otherwise harmonious melody. Lord Valerius, a man whose laughter filled every room he entered, was oblivious to this undercurrent. His wife, Lady Seraphina, a woman of quiet piety and gentle demeanor, seemed to sense it, though she never spoke of it. Melissa often caught Lady Seraphina gazing out at the orchards with a distant, troubled look in her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. The first signs of the blight were dismissed as a minor inconvenience. A few apples, here and there, would ripen prematurely, their skin mottled with dark, bruise-like spots, their flesh tasting faintly bitter. Then the blight spread, more apples, then entire branches, then whole trees. The vibrant green leaves began to turn a sickly yellow, then a brittle brown, crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. The sweet scent of blossoms was slowly replaced by a faint, cloying odor, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. The jovial nature of Appler's citizens began to wane. The songs in the taverns grew quieter, the dances less spirited. A pervasive melancholy settled over the city, like a persistent fog. People complained of restless nights, filled with vague, unsettling dreams they couldn't quite recall upon waking, leaving only a residue of dread. They spoke of a fading joy, a slow erosion of their happiness. Melissa felt it too. Her own dreams became a swirling vortex of muted colors and indistinct whispers, leaving her drained and anxious. The vibrant tapestries in her room seemed to lose their luster. The sunlight through her windows felt less warm. She found herself staring blankly at the garden. The beauty of it somehow diminished. Lord Valerius, initially dismissive, grew increasingly agitated. He ordered prayers, then sent for healers and botanists, but nothing stemmed the blight or the creeping despair. Lady Seraphina, however, seemed to wither with the orchards. Her gentle smile vanished, replaced by a permanent frown of worry. Her eyes, once soft, now held a haunted look. One evening, Melissa found Lady Seraphina in the manor's private chapel, kneeling before a crucifix, her body trembling. As Melissa approached, she heard Lady Seraphina whispering, The price is too high. The joy, it demands the joy." Melissa hesitated. "Lady Seraphina? What price? What demands the joy?" Lady Seraphina flinched, turning slowly. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to look through Melissa. "The covenant," she whispered, her voice reedy and thin. "The ancient covenant. For the abundance, for the prosperity. It demands the essence of our happiness. And it is hungry." Before Melissa could question further, Lady Seraphina collapsed, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaping her lips. Melissa rushed to her, but it was too late. Lady Seraphina's skin was cold, her face serene, yet utterly devoid of any warmth or color. She looked like a doll carved from pale wood. And around her, Melissa detected the faint, cloying scent of overripe, decaying apples. Lord Valerius was distraught. He declared it a sudden illness, but Melissa knew better. Lady Seraphina had been consumed by the fading joy. The death of Lady Seraphina seemed to accelerate Appler's decline. The blight consumed the last of the orchards, leaving behind a skeletal landscape of barren trees. The city, once bustling, was now eerily quiet. The vibrant festivals were replaced by hushed gatherings, where people sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of spark. They were losing their memories of happiness, their laughter, their very essence. Melissa, terrified, sought answers. She remembered an old, reclusive scholar, Master Alara, who lived on the outskirts of Appler, known for his knowledge of ancient lore. She knew Lord Valerius would never permit her to leave, so she slipped out of the manor under the cloak of night, her heart pounding. Master Alara's cottage was a small, ramshackle dwelling surrounded by withered herbs and dead vines. He was an ancient man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and knowing. Melissa recounted the blight, the fading joy, Lady Seraphina's words. Master Alara listened, his expression grim. "The Covenant of Appler," he finally said, his voice raspy. "It is not a myth. Centuries ago, when this valley was barren, the founders made a pact with an ancient spirit of the land. For eternal abundance, for bountiful harvests, they offered a tithe, not of gold, nor blood, but of pure joy. Each generation, the spirit would draw a portion of the city's collective happiness, ensuring the orchards thrive." Melissa shivered. "But now, it takes everything? The covenant was broken," Master Alara explained. "The founders, fearing the spirit's growing hunger, tried to cheat it, to offer less. The spirit, angered, twisted the pact. Now it does not merely draw joy, it devours it. And when the well of joy runs dry, it begins to take the memories of joy, then the capacity for joy, until nothing but despair remains." He pointed to a withered apple on his table, its skin black and shriveled. "This is what happens when joy is consumed. How can it be stopped?" Melissa asked, desperation in her voice. Master Alara sighed, shaking his head. "The spirit must be appeased, truly appeased. A pure heart, willingly offered, filled with genuine joy. Such a thing is rare in Appler now." He looked at Melissa, his eyes piercing. "The spirit is strongest at the heart of the orchards, where the first apple tree was planted, the site of the original covenant." Melissa left Master Alara's cottage with a heavy heart. A pure heart, filled with genuine joy. Who in Appler possessed such a thing now? She thought of Lord Valerius, consumed by his own grief and the city's decline. She thought of the blank faces she had seen in the streets. Returning to the manor, Melissa found it eerily silent. Lord Valerius's usual boisterous presence was gone. She found him in his study, slumped over his desk, his face pale, his eyes distant. He was muttering to himself, not of grief, but of trivial matters, his mind slowly unraveling, his joy already consumed. He barely registered her presence. The city outside was bathed in a sickly, pale light, not from the sun, but from the decaying orchards, a faint, ghostly luminescence. The air was thick with the scent of rotten apples and despair. The whispers were everywhere now, carried on the wind, a chorus of forgotten laughter and fading memories. Melissa knew she couldn't stay. She would be consumed just like Lady Seraphina, just like Lord Valerius, just like the entire city. But she also knew she couldn't simply flee. The thought of Appler, once so vibrant, being utterly consumed by despair, gnawed at her. She thought of the original covenant of the first apple tree. The oldest tree in the valley, a gnarled ancient thing, stood at the very center of the now blighted orchards. It was said to be the source of Appler's prosperity. It must also be the heart of the curse. Under the cover of a moonless night, Melissa made her way to the orchards. The skeletal branches of the apple trees clawed at the sky, casting grotesque shadows. The ground was littered with shriveled, black apples. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of decay and the pervasive whispers of forgotten joy. She walked deeper into the orchards, the whispers growing louder, swirling around her, a cacophony of lost happiness. She felt a profound sadness, a crushing weight of despair that threatened to overwhelm her. It was the spirit, feeding on the remnants of Appler's joy. Finally, she reached the ancient apple tree. It stood alone, a twisted, monstrous silhouette against the pale, sickly sky. Its bark was black and cracked, its branches bare and brittle. At its base, a faint, pulsating glow emanated from the earth, a sickly green light that seemed to draw all warmth from the air. As Melissa approached, the ground around the tree began to ripple, and a formless shadow, composed of swirling darkness and the pale green light, began to coalesce from the earth. It was the spirit, vast and ancient, its presence radiating an unbearable emptiness. The whispers intensified, a chorus of despair that echoed in her mind. The spirit's form solidified, vaguely humanoid, but shifting, ethereal. Its eyes two glowing green orbs that held an ancient, predatory hunger. It reached out a shadowy tendril towards her, and Melissa felt a sudden, profound drain, as if her very essence was being siphoned away. Memories of her own past joys, fleeting moments of laughter, of love, began to fade, replaced by a dull ache. She stumbled back, clutching her chest. This was it. This was the fading joy. She was being consumed. Then, a thought, clear and sharp, cut through the encroaching despair. Master Alera's words, a pure heart, willingly offered, filled with genuine joy. Melissa had lived a life of compromises, of secrets, of a love that was forbidden. Her joy was often tinged with sorrow, her happiness with guilt. But in this moment, facing oblivion, a different kind of joy welled within her, the joy of defiance, of courage, of a desperate hope for a city she had come to care for. It was a fierce, defiant joy, born of desperation and a newfound purpose. She looked at the spirit, her eyes burning with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. "You will not take everything," she cried, her voice trembling but firm. "You will not turn Appler into a wasteland of despair." The spirit recoiled slightly, its shadowy form wavering, as if surprised by her defiance, by the unexpected surge of genuine, if desperate, joy. Its tendrils lashed out, but Melissa stood her ground. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she had to act. She remembered the old folk tales of appeasing spirits with offerings, not of joy, but something symbolic. She looked around, her eyes falling on a single, shriveled apple at the base of the ancient tree, the last remnant of Appler's once bountiful harvest. With a sudden burst of strength, Melissa snatched the apple. It was cold and hard, its skin black and shriveled. She held it up, not as an offering of joy, but as a symbol of the city's lost happiness and her defiant hope for its return. "This," she declared, her voice ringing through the blighted orchard, "is what you have taken, but you will not take our hope. You will not take our future." As she spoke, she crushed the shriveled apple in her hand. A faint, sickly green mist rose from it, and the spirit recoiled further, its form flickering. It was not the pure joy it craved, but a confrontation, a defiance that it had not anticipated. The spirit let out a piercing, mournful shriek, a sound of ancient rage and frustration. Its shadowy tendrils lashed out wildly, tearing at the air, but they no longer sought to drain her. Instead, they seemed to push her away, repulsed by her unexpected defiance. Melissa stumbled backward, away from the ancient tree, away from the pulsating green light and the shrieking spirit. She ran, not in fear, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The spirit, she realized, was not all-powerful, could be defied, could be repelled. She ran until she was out of the orchards, until the sickly green glow was a distant memory. She ran until she reached the city walls, her lungs burning, her body aching, but her mind clear. The city was still quiet, still shrouded in melancholy, but the whispers seemed fainter, the air less heavy with decay. The spirit had been repelled, not appeased, but repelled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Melissa knew that Appler was not saved. Not yet. The blight remained. The joy was still faded. But she had seen the spirit's weakness, its vulnerability to defiance. It was a long road, but there was hope. She would not flee Appler. She would stay. She would find a way to truly appease the spirit, to restore the city's joy, or to break the covenant forever. She, the mistress, the woman on the fringes, would fight for the city that had unwittingly become her home. And as the first faint light of dawn broke over the blighted valley, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Melissa stood firm, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a city slowly awakening, ready to face the whispers of Appler. In the heart of a verdant valley, nestled beside the winding river Viridian, lay the village of Opiate. It was the 11th century, a time when the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, the bounty of the earth, and the whims of the heavens. Most men in Opiate tilled the soil, hunted the forests, or crafted simple wares. But among them was Oak, a man whose mind moved not with the plow, but with the gears of logic, the flow of water, and the strength of stone. Oak was an anomaly. While others saw a fallen tree as firewood, he saw the potential for a sturdy beam. Where a stream was merely water, he envisioned its power harnessed to grind grain. His hands, though calloused from labor, were also deft at sketching intricate designs on parchment, designs that often bewildered his fellow villagers. He was an engineer, though the term itself was centuries from being coined in their tongue. They simply called him Oak, the builder of wonders, or sometimes, less charitably, Oak, the dreamer of impossible things. His dwelling, a sturdy, well-built cottage at the edge of the village, was less a home and more a workshop. It was filled with strange contraptions. Levers he'd fashioned, gears carved from seasoned oak, and models of water wheels that spun silently on his workbench. His greatest joy was not in the harvest, but in the meticulous planning and execution of a project, in seeing an idea take tangible form, serving the needs of his community. For generations, Opiate had prospered, its fields watered by the reliable Viridian. But the last 2 summers had been cruel. The rains had dwindled, and the Viridian, once a robust artery, had become a sluggish vein, its waters barely reaching the furthest fields. The crops, the very lifeblood of Opiate, withered under the relentless sun. Desperation began to creep into the villagers' eyes, a fear more potent than any raiding party. Elder Thistle, his face a roadmap of Opiate's history, summoned Oak to the communal hall. "Oak," he began, his voice raspy with worry. "The river fails us. The gods are displeased, or perhaps the earth itself grows weary. Our granaries will be empty before winter's first frost. We need water, Oak, more water than the Viridian now provides." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered villagers. Some spoke of prayers, others of sacrifice. But Oak, his gaze distant, was already calculating. He knew the gods were not to blame for the lack of rain, nor the earth for its weariness. The problem was one of distribution, of access. "Elder Thistle," Oak said, his voice calm. "The Viridian is low, yes, but there are other sources. High in the hills to the north, where the snows linger longest, there is the Whispering Spring. Its waters flow year-round, cold and clear. If we could bring that water to Opiate, our fields would flourish once more." A gasp went through the hall. The Whispering Spring was known, but it was a journey of a day and a half, across treacherous terrain, through dense forests and over rocky ridges. To bring its water to Opiate seemed an impossible feat. "Bring it?" scoffed Boren, the village blacksmith, a man of brawn, not vision. "Are we to carry it in buckets, Oak? 1,000 buckets for 1,000 days?" Oak smiled faintly. "Not in buckets, Boren. In a channel, an aqueduct." Silence descended, heavy and disbelieving. An aqueduct. The word itself sounded like something from ancient legends, tales of grand empires long crumbled to dust. No one in Opiate or any neighboring village had ever seen such a thing. "It is a monumental undertaking," Oak continued, undeterred by their skepticism. "It will require stone, wood, and many hands. We will need to survey the land, to find the gentlest slope, to build bridges over ravines and tunnels through hills. But it is possible. I have studied the flow of water, the strength of arches. I believe we can do it. Elder Thistle, despite his initial shock, saw a flicker of hope in Oak's eyes. He had known Oak since he was a boy, always tinkering, always observing. "How long, Oak?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A full season, perhaps two, if the gods grant us good weather and strong backs," Oak replied. "But the alternative is starvation." The choice, though daunting, was clear. The villagers, facing ruin, reluctantly agreed. Oak, with a renewed sense of purpose, began his work. His first task was to survey the land. With only a rudimentary level fashioned from a bowl of water and a plumb bob, and a long, straight staff, he set out. Days turned into weeks as he traversed the rugged terrain between Opiid and the Whispering Spring. He mapped the contours of the land in his mind, noting every rise and fall, every potential obstacle. He calculated gradients, envisioning the subtle, constant decline that would allow the water to flow by gravity alone. It was a painstaking process, relying on keen observation and an intuitive understanding of physics. He returned to Opiid, his clothes torn, his face weathered, but his eyes alight with a plan. He gathered the villagers again, this time with a large, flat stone on which he had scratched a rough map. He pointed to the spring, then to Opiid, tracing a winding path. "Here," he explained, indicating a deep ravine, "we will build a bridge of stone with arches strong enough to bear the channel. And here," he pointed to a low hill, "we will dig a tunnel, just deep enough to maintain the flow." Borin, the blacksmith, still skeptical but intrigued, asked, "And the stone for this bridge? The wood for the scaffolding? Where will it come from?" "The forest will provide the wood," Oak answered, "and the quarry to the west, though distant, has ample stone. We will need carts, strong oxen, and many hands to haul it." The scale of the project was immense, almost unimaginable, but Oak's quiet confidence, his meticulous planning, began to sway even the most doubtful. He wasn't just dreaming, he was outlining a path, step by arduous step. The first phase was quarrying. Oak taught the villagers how to split stone using wedges and the power of freezing water. He designed simple yet effective sledges for hauling the massive blocks. Men who had only ever known the feel of a plow handle now learned the rhythm of the hammer and chisel. The forest echoed with the thud of axes as trees were felled for scaffolding and supports. Oak was everywhere, overseeing, instructing, encouraging. He showed them how to lay foundations, how to mix mortar from local clay and sand, how to shape stones for a perfect fit. He taught them the principle of the arch, demonstrating how individual stones, seemingly weak on their own, could, when combined in a curve, bear immense weight. The construction of the ravine bridge was the most challenging. It required precision Oak had only ever practiced in his models. He devised a system of ropes and pulleys, using the leverage of tall trees to hoist the heavy stones into place. Days were long, filled with the grunts of straining men, the clang of tools, and Oak's calm, steady instructions. There were setbacks, of course. A poorly placed stone would shift, a section of scaffolding would creak ominously, sending hearts into throats. But Oak, unflappable, would assess the problem, devise a solution, and urge them onward. He faced not just physical challenges, but human ones. Some workers grew weary, their faith in the impossible project wavering. Others grumbled about the endless labor, the missed harvests. Oak addressed their concerns with patience, reminding them of the alternative, of the parched earth and empty stomachs. He shared his vision, painting a picture of Opiid flourishing again, its fields green, its granaries full. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a section of the newly built bridge, a small arch, collapsed. A collective groan went through the weary workers. Borin threw down his hammer in frustration. "It's cursed Oak. The gods do not wish this channel built." Oak walked to the fallen stones, examining them closely. He ran his hand over the broken edges, then looked at the remaining structure. "No curse, Borin," he said, his voice calm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "A miscalculation. The mortar in this section was too thin, or perhaps the stone was flawed. We will rebuild it, stronger." He spent the night re-examining his plans, adjusting his measurements, and by dawn, he had a revised approach. He showed the men how to test the strength of each stone, how to ensure the mortar was mixed to the perfect consistency. Slowly, painstakingly, they rebuilt the collapsed section, and this time it held. The incident, though a setback, ultimately strengthened their resolve and their trust in Oak's methods. The tunnel through the hill was another formidable task. Oak designed a system of bracing with timber to prevent collapses as they dug. He taught them how to use fire and water to crack stubborn rock, and how to remove the loosened debris. The work was claustrophobic and dangerous, but the thought of the water, flowing freely, pushed them forward. As the second season of construction began, the drought worsened. The Viridian was now little more than a trickle, a muddy ditch where fish lay gasping. The villagers watched the progress of the aqueduct with a desperate hope. Every stone laid, every foot of channel dug, was a promise of survival. Finally, after nearly 2 full years of relentless labor, the aqueduct was complete. It snaked across the landscape, a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance. A thin, gray line connecting the distant Whispering Spring to the parched fields of Opiate. The day of the water's arrival was etched into the memory of every villager. Oak stood at the head of the channel, high up near the spring, with elder thistle and a few of the most dedicated workers. The channel had been cleaned, its path cleared of any debris. With a deep breath, Oak gave the signal. Slowly, carefully, they removed the final barrier, a temporary dam of earth and stone that had held back the spring's flow. A hush fell over the small group. Then, a faint gurgle growing louder as the clear, cold water of the Whispering Spring began its journey. It flowed, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, down the channel Oak had designed, over the bridge he had built, and through the tunnel he had dug. Word spread like wildfire through Opiate. Villagers rushed to the edge of their fields, their eyes wide with anticipation. And then they saw it, a shimmering ribbon of water, catching the morning sun, flowing steadily towards them. A cheer erupted, a joyous, tearful sound that echoed through the valley. Children splashed in the cool water as it filled the irrigation ditches, their laughter a melody Opiate had not heard in too long. The fields, once brown and brittle, slowly began to drink. Within days, a faint green blush appeared, a promise of life renewed. The granaries, which had seemed destined for emptiness, would now be filled. Oak, standing by the newly flowing channel, felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the cheers or the accolades that moved him most, but the sight of the water itself, fulfilling its purpose, bringing life to the land. He had taken an idea, a dream, and made it real using the principles of the earth itself. His reputation spread far beyond Opiate. Travelers spoke of the water miracle of Opiate, and soon other villages, facing their own challenges, sought his counsel. He helped them build better mills, design more efficient plows, and construct sturdier homes. He was no longer just Oak, the builder of wonders, but Oak, the engineer, a man who understood the hidden language of the world and could translate it into solutions for the common good. Opiate prospered, its fields bountiful, its people thriving. The aqueduct, a marvel of 11th century engineering, stood as a silent monument to Oak's vision and the collective effort of a desperate village. And Oak, in his quiet workshop, continued to dream of impossible things, knowing that with enough thought, enough effort, and a deep understanding of the world's mechanics, even the most impossible dreams could be made real. He had not just built a channel for water, he had built a channel for hope, for progress, for the future of Opiate. The shadow of thick monk. The year of our Lord 1287 was not a kind one to the village of Oakhaven. A harsh winter had bled into a meager spring, and now, as summer grudgingly yielded to autumn, a different chill began to settle upon the land. one that had nothing to do with the biting winds. It was a chill that seeped into the bones, whispered through the bare branches of the ancient oaks, and tightened the throats of even the bravest men. Manny, short for Manuela, was a girl of 13 summers, with eyes the color of the deepest forest moss and a spirit as untamed as the wild ponies that grazed on the distant moors. Unlike the other village girls, who were content with their spinning wheels and their gossip, Manny found her solace in the hushed embrace of the woods that skirted Oakhaven. Her father, a stoic woodcutter named Thomas, often chided her for her wanderings, but her mother, Alara, a woman with a quiet understanding of the world's unseen currents, merely smiled and pressed a piece of dried apple into her hand before she ventured out. It was in these woods, specifically near the edge of a place the villagers called Thick Monk, that the first whispers of the new chill began. Thick Monk was a place shunned by all. It was said to be where the ancient spirits of the land slept, and where, long ago, a pagan circle had been defiled by a terrible act. No one went there, not even the most desperate poacher. Its trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. Even in the brightest midday, a gloom clung to the dell, and the air was always unnaturally still and cold. Manny, however, possessed a stubborn streak that often outweighed her fear. One late afternoon, while gathering herbs for her mother, she found herself closer to the dell than she intended. A strange, almost melodic hum seemed to drift from its depths, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. Curiosity, a dangerous companion, tugged at her. She told herself it was just the wind, or perhaps a rare bird. But as she crept closer, parting the thick undergrowth, the hum grew louder, more insistent, and undeniably wrong. It wasn't wind. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Then she saw it, not within the dell, but just at its periphery. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, lying half-buried in the moss. It was unlike any carving she had ever seen, its eyes two tiny, polished obsidian chips that seemed to glint with an inner light. As she reached for it, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from within the dell, like a branch snapping under an unseen weight. Manny snatched her hand back, her heart leaping into her throat. The hum intensified, throbbing in her ears. A wave of profound cold washed over her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. She scrambled backward, dropping the bird, and fled, not daring to look behind her until she burst into the familiar clearing of Oakhaven. She told her mother about the bird and the strange hum, but Alara, though she listened with a thoughtful frown, dismissed it as the overactive imagination of a girl who spent too much time alone. "The woods play tricks on the mind, child," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And Thick Monk is best left undisturbed." Manny tried to believe her, but the image of the bird's obsidian eyes haunted her dreams that night. She woke several times, convinced she heard the faint, bone-chime hum outside her window. The unsettling occurrences began subtly. A tool would go missing from her father's workshop, only to reappear days later in an impossible place, on the roof of the barn, or tucked inside the church's bell tower. Whispers, too faint to discern words, would drift through the village square when no one was speaking. Livestock grew restless, their eyes wide and rolling, their lowing filled with an unusual distress. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, Manny was helping her mother prepare supper. A sudden, piercing shriek tore through the air from outside. It was the sound of a cat, not just in pain, but in sheer, unadulterated terror. Manny and Alara rushed to the window, peering into the deepening twilight. Their neighbor, Old Master Eldrin, stood in his yard, his face ashen, pointing a trembling finger at his shed. His prized ginger tomcat, Barnaby, lay motionless on the ground, its body twisted at an unnatural angle, its eyes wide and staring at something only it had seen. But there was no mark on it, no blood, no sign of struggle. It looked as if its very spirit had been squeezed from its body. A murmur of unease rippled through the village. Such deaths were unheard of. The priest, Father Michael, a stern but kindly man, spoke of God's mysterious ways and the fragility of life, but even his voice lacked its usual conviction. Manny, however, remembered the hum, the cold, the obsidian eyes. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the core that this was not God's way. The next day, a young boy named Finn, known for his mischievous spirit, claimed he saw shadows moving in the daylight, shadows that didn't belong to any person or tree. He described them as too tall, too thin, and said they seemed to glide rather than walk. His parents, embarrassed, scolded him for telling tales, but Manny saw the genuine terror in his eyes. The fear escalated. Small objects began to vanish from homes, a silver locket from one, a child's wooden toy from another. Then, a chilling discovery. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, identical to the one Manny had seen near Thick Monk, was found on the doorstep of the missing locket's owner. Its obsidian eyes seemed to gleam mockingly. Manny knew then. The hum, the cold, the bird, they were all connected. This wasn't a natural evil. This was something ancient, something that had been disturbed. She tried to speak to her father again, but Thomas, a practical man, scoffed. Superstition, child. The devil finds work for idle hands, and fear finds shadows where there are none. Desperate, Manny sought out Alara. Her mother, usually so calm, looked troubled. "I feel it too, Manny," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "A coldness that isn't of winter, presence. But what can we do? We are simple folk." "The bird," Manny insisted. "It's the same one. It came from the dell." Alara's eyes widened. "You found it near Thick Monk? Oh, Manny, you should never have gone there. That place, it holds old secrets, dark secrets." She then recounted hushed tales of a forgotten pagan cult that once worshipped a malevolent entity in the dell, a being of shadow and cold that demanded tribute. The cult was long gone, wiped out by the righteous hand of the church, but the villagers believed the entity still lingered, dormant, waiting. "Someone must have disturbed it," Manny concluded. "Someone must have gone into the dell." A terrible thought struck her. The missing objects the bird left behind, it was like a trail, a taunt. The entity was announcing its presence, growing stronger. The nights became a torment. The hum was no longer faint. It was a low thrumming that vibrated through the very foundations of their cottage. Whispers slithered under the door, through the cracks in the walls, forming words that were just beyond comprehension, like a forgotten language spoken in the depths of a nightmare. Manny saw shadows dance in her peripheral vision, elongated and grotesque, only to vanish when she turned her head. One night, she woke to the sound of her mother crying out. Manny rushed to her side. Alara was clutching her arm, her face pale with fright. "It touched me, Manny," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A hand cold as ice. It tried to pull me from the bed." There was a faint, bruised mark on Alara's arm, like the imprint of skeletal fingers. Panic began to grip Oakhaven. Several more livestock were found dead, their bodies unmarked but their eyes wide with terror. A young woman, Martha, woke to find her hair braided into an intricate, impossible pattern while she slept, a pattern no human hand could have created. Fear bred suspicion, and villagers began to eye each other, wondering who among them had brought this curse upon them. Manny knew they couldn't wait. The entity was no longer content with subtle hints. It was reaching out, its grip tightening. She remembered the stories her mother told her of the old ways of wards and protections. But those were pagan beliefs forbidden by the church. Yet what good was the church now, when the very air was thick with dread? She decided she had to go back to Thick Monk. Not to confront it directly, not yet, but to understand. To find out what had been disturbed. She knew it was madness, but the alternative, waiting for the shadow to consume them all, was worse. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Manny slipped out of her cottage. The air was heavy, still, and unnaturally cold, even for autumn. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a monstrous footstep behind her. The hum, now a constant, low drone, guided her, pulling her deeper into the woods. As she neared thick monk, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwined like grasping claws. The ground became uneven, littered with ancient, moss-covered stones. The cold intensified, biting at her exposed skin, making her teeth chatter. She could see her breath in the frigid air, even though it was not yet winter. Then she saw it, the clearing. It was not a natural clearing, but a circle of standing stones, half buried in the earth, their surfaces eroded by centuries of wind and rain. This was the defiled pagan circle her mother had spoken of. In the very center of the circle, something glinted. Manny approached cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a small, ornate silver cross, its surface tarnished and dull. It looked ancient, perhaps something left by the church after they had purged the pagan cult. But it wasn't just lying there. It was impaled into the ground, driven deep into the earth. And around it, the earth was scorched, as if by a terrible fire, yet the surrounding moss was untouched. And then she understood. This was not a defilement by the pagans. This was the church's attempt to bind the entity, to seal it away. The silver cross, a symbol of holy power, had been driven into the heart of the dell, trapping the malevolent spirit. But something had disturbed it. Something had loosened it. As she looked closer, she saw faint scratch marks on the ground around the cross, as if something had tried to pry it loose. And then, a small, dark object caught her eye, half hidden beneath a stone. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle and crumbling. Manny picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was filled with strange symbols and crude drawings, and a language she didn't understand. But on the very last page, a familiar image was sketched. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, its eyes obsidian chips. Someone had been here, someone had tried to undo the binding. And the wooden birds were a sign, a calling card. A sudden, sharp gust of wind swept through the dell, though the surrounding trees remained still. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very ground beneath her feet. The air grew impossibly cold, and a dark, swirling mist began to rise from the center of the circle, coiling around the silver cross. Manny felt a presence, vast and ancient, pressing down on her, suffocating her. It was pure, unadulterated malice. She dropped the book, her hands instinctively going to her mouth to stifle a scream. The mist coalesced, forming a towering, indistinct shape, darker than the deepest night, with two pinpricks of glowing red light that could only be eyes. A voice, not of sound but of thought, echoed in her mind, cold and sharp as ice shards. You trespass. You pry. The binding weakens. Soon freedom. Manny stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The entity lunged, not with physical speed, but with a terrifying, ethereal swiftness. She felt an icy grip on her ankle, pulling her towards the swirling mist. Panic seized her. She thrashed, kicking wildly, but the grip was relentless, cold, and strong. Her hands scrabbled on the ground, and her fingers closed around something hard and smooth. It was the wooden bird she had dropped earlier. In a desperate, unthinking act, she threw it at the looming shadow. As the bird struck the swirling mist, there was a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening crack, like thunder striking the earth. The entity recoiled, its form momentarily dissipating, and the icy grip on her ankle vanished. The hum fractured into a cacophony of screeching, tormented whispers. Manny scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew she had to get away. She turned and ran, not looking back. The sounds of the dell, the screeches, the hum, the chilling whispers fading behind her as she burst back into the familiar, if still fearful, woods. She didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, collapsing against the sturdy trunk of an oak tree, gasping for breath, her body trembling from head to toe. She stumbled back into her cottage, waking her parents with her disheveled appearance and frantic story. Thomas, seeing the genuine terror in her eyes and the faint, icy burn mark on her ankle, finally believed her. Alara, her face grim, examined the mark. "It tried to claim you, child," she whispered, pressing a cold cloth to it. Manny explained about the silver cross, the book, and the entity. "Someone tried to free it," she insisted. "The book, it had the bird drawn in it, and the cross was loose." The next morning, Thomas, armed with his largest axe, and accompanied by Father Michael, who now looked pale and shaken, ventured into Thick Monk. Manny, despite her mother's protests, insisted on going with them, pointing the way. They found the silver cross, indeed loose in the earth, and the scorched ground around it. The air was still cold, but the oppressive malice was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of desolation. Father Michael, his face etched with fear and grim determination, knelt and redrove the cross deep into the earth, chanting prayers in Latin, his voice trembling but firm. He then sprinkled holy water around the entire circle, his movements deliberate and solemn. The book was gone. Manny remembered dropping it when the entity attacked, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as if the dell had swallowed it whole. Back in the village, Father Michael gathered the villagers. His voice, usually booming, was now hushed, filled with a newfound gravity. He spoke not of God's mysterious ways, but of ancient evils, of the need for vigilance, and of the power of faith and unity. He didn't mention Manny by name, but his eyes met hers, a silent acknowledgement of her bravery. The strange occurrences did not cease immediately. The hum could still be heard faintly on certain nights, and shadows still seemed to lengthen unnaturally. But the intense cold, the direct attacks, the missing objects, these stopped. The entity had been pushed back, its power diminished, its binding reinforced. Manny, however, was changed. The woods, once her sanctuary, now held a deeper, more complex meaning. She still ventured into them, but with a new respect, a new understanding of the unseen forces that lay beneath the surface of the world. She learned to listen not just to the rustle of leaves, but to the silence that followed, to the subtle shifts in the air. The wooden birds, however, continued to appear. Not in the village, but sometimes, Manny would find one on the edge of the woods, near the path to Thick Monk. Always the same, intricately carved, with obsidian eyes that seemed to watch her. She never touched them. She merely looked at them, a shiver running down her spine, and then walked away. The shadow of Thick Monk had receded, but it had not vanished. It was a constant reminder, a silent promise that some evils merely slumber, waiting for the right moment or the right hand to awaken them once more. And Manny, the girl who had faced the darkness, carried that knowledge with her, a silent guardian of Oakhaven, forever listening for the hum, forever watching for the shadows, forever remembering the chilling glint in obsidian eyes. The 13th century was a time of faith and fear, and Manny had seen the true face of the latter. And she knew, deep in her heart, that it would return. The year of our Lord 1542 dawned with a chill that seeped not just into the bones, but into the very soul of England. A pestilence, insidious and swift, had begun its silent march across the land, leaving in its wake a trail of swollen glands, blackened extremities, and the stench of fear. In the bustling, yet perpetually grimy city of London, where the Thames flowed thick with refuse and ambition, lived Master Carlyle Thorne, a physician of some repute, though his methods were often whispered about in hushed tones. Carlyle was a man of science, or at least what passed for science in an age dominated by humors and divine wrath. His chambers, nestled in a narrow alley off Fleet Street, were a curious blend of the scholarly and the macabre. Books, leather-bound and brittle with age, lined shelves alongside jars of leeches, dried herbs, and surgical instruments that glinted ominously in the dim light. He possessed a keen intellect, a sharp eye, and a hand steady enough to wield a lancet with precision. Yet there was a certain coldness in his gaze, a detachment that unnerved even his most desperate patients. The plague, or the great mortality, as some were beginning to call it, was Carlyle's grim muse. While other physicians fled the city or resorted to desperate prayers, Carlyle plunged headlong into the epidemic, driven by a thirst for knowledge that bordered on obsession. He dissected the dead, a practice deemed sacrilegious by many, but one he believed held the key to understanding the disease. His notes, meticulously penned in a small, cramped hand, filled dozens of parchment scrolls, detailing the progression of the buboes, the discoloration of the skin, the final, agonizing breaths. One particularly bleak autumn evening, a messenger arrived at Carlyle's door, his face pale and contorted with terror. He bore a summons from Sir Alaric Finch, a wealthy merchant whose sprawling manor lay just beyond the city walls. Sir Alaric's youngest daughter, Alara, had been struck down by the plague. The family, desperate and wealthy enough to afford any price, implored Carlyle to come at once. Carlyle, ever the pragmatist, saw not just a patient, but an opportunity. The Finch family was known for their meticulous records, their vast library, and their isolation. It was a chance to observe the disease in a controlled environment, away from the chaotic squalor of the city. He gathered his instruments, a pungent concoction of protective herbs, and a small, leather-bound journal. The journey to Finch Manor was a somber one. The air was thick with the smell of burning tar and wood, an attempt by the city to cleanse itself of the contagion. Carts laden with shrouded bodies rumbled past, their drivers masked and silent. Carlyle, however, felt no fear, only a strange exhilaration. He was a hunter, and the plague was his prey. Finch Manor was a grand, imposing structure, its stone walls exuding an aura of ancient wealth and quiet despair. A nervous butler led Carlyle through dimly lit corridors, the tapestries on the walls seeming to absorb the light, leaving only shadows. The air grew heavier with each step, laden with the sickly sweet scent of illness and the metallic tang of fear. Alara lay in a vast, four-poster bed, her small body racked with fever. Her skin was flushed, her eyes glazed, and a single, angry bubo pulsed ominously in her armpit. Sir Alaric and his wife, Lady Eleanor, stood by the bedside, their faces etched with grief and helplessness. Carlyle approached the bed, his expression unreadable. He examined the girl with a practiced hand, his fingers tracing the inflamed gland. "The bubo is ripe," he murmured, more to himself than to the distraught parents. "The fever burns fiercely." Lady Eleanor let out a choked sob. "Can you save her, Master Thorne? Please, tell us there is hope." Carlyle turned to them, his eyes unblinking. "Hope is a fragile thing, my lady, in times such as these, but I will do what I can. I require absolute solitude with the patient."
No interruptions, no distractions.
Sir Alaric, desperate, readily agreed. "Anything, Master Thorne, anything at all." For days, Carlyle remained cloistered in Alara's chambers. He bled her, a common practice of the time, believing it would release the corrupted humors. He applied poultices of strange, dark herbs to the bubo, muttering incantations that sounded more scientific than spiritual. He observed, he documented, and he waited. The manor grew silent, save for the occasional moan from Alara's room or the hushed whispers of the servants. Sir Alaric and Lady Eleanor paced the halls, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. On the third night, a piercing scream echoed through the manor, a sound that tore through the stillness and sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. It was Alara's scream, but it was not the cry of a child in pain. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Sir Alaric, ignoring all of Carlyle's warnings, burst into the room, followed closely by Lady Eleanor. The sight that greeted them froze the blood in their veins. Alara was thrashing in the bed, her eyes wide and unfocused, her small hands clawing at the air. But it was not just the fever that gripped her. Her skin, once pale, was now a mottled gray, and thin, black lines snaked beneath the surface, spreading like a grotesque spiderweb. The bubo in her armpit had burst, but instead of pus, a viscous, inky fluid oozed from the wound, staining the sheets. Carlyle stood over her, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, a strange, almost rapturous expression on his face. In his hand, he held a small, gleaming needle, its tip stained with the same black fluid. "What have you done?" Lady Eleanor shrieked, her voice a raw cry of anguish. Carlyle turned, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I have merely accelerated the process, my lady. The plague, it is not merely a disease of the humors. It is a transformation, a corruption of the very essence. Sir Alaric lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. You monster! You have tortured my daughter. Carlyle sidestepped him with surprising agility. Torture? No, Sir Alaric. I have merely observed, and in my observation, I have uncovered a truth far more terrifying than any fever. As he spoke, Alara's thrashing intensified. Her small body began to contort in unnatural ways, her limbs twisting and bending as if controlled by unseen strings. A low, guttural growl emanated from her throat, a sound utterly alien to a child. Lady Eleanor collapsed to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. Sir Alaric, momentarily stunned, stared at his daughter, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. Carlyle, however, seemed invigorated by the spectacle. The black lines, they are not merely discoloration. They are pathways, channels for the corruption to spread, to consume. And the fluid, it is not pus. It is the very essence of the plague, concentrated, distilled. He held up the needle, its tip still dripping. I have been extracting it, studying it, and I have found it is alive. Before Sir Alaric could react, Alara's head snapped towards Carlyle. Her eyes, once innocent, were now black and hollow, devoid of any humanity. Her mouth opened, revealing not a child's tongue, but a writhing, black mass, like a nest of worms. A shriek, inhuman and chilling, tore from her throat, and she lunged at Carlyle. The physician, however, was prepared. He moved with a speed that belied his age, dodging her grotesque attack. Fascinating, he murmured, his voice laced with a disturbing curiosity. The transformation is complete. The host is consumed, and the plague, it walks. Sir Alaric, finally breaking free of his stupor, grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table. Get away from her, you demon! He roared, swinging the candlestick at Carlyle. Carlyle parried the blow with surprising strength, his eyes never leaving the transformed child. You do not understand, Sir Alaric. This is not just your daughter. This is the plague manifest, and I am its student. Alara, with an unnatural strength, scrambled from the bed and onto the floor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a madman. She crawled towards Sir Alaric, her black eyes fixed on him, the writhing mass in her mouth pulsating. Lady Eleanor, seeing the abomination that was once her child, let out a scream that was quickly cut short as Alara lunged, her tiny hands, now tipped with sharpened, blackened nails, tearing at her mother's throat. Blood spurted, a crimson spray against the dark tapestries. Lady Eleanor fell, her eyes wide with terror, her life draining away in a crimson tide. Sir Alaric, witnessing the horrific murder of his wife by his own daughter, roared with a grief and fury that transcended all fear. He charged at Alara, but the transformed child was no longer frail. She moved with a terrifying agility, dodging his blows, her growls growing louder, more animalistic. Carlyle stood back, observing the macabre dance with a detached fascination. He made no move to intervene, his gaze fixed on the horrifying spectacle, his mind racing with theories and observations. Alara, with a final savage lunge, brought Sir Alaric down. Her small, corrupted body pinned him to the floor, and the black mass in her mouth extended, tendrils of darkness reaching for his face. His screams were choked off as the tendrils entered his mouth, his nose, his eyes. The room fell silent, save for the wet, tearing sounds and Carlyle's soft, almost reverent breathing. When Alara finally rose, her small form was covered in blood, her eyes still black and empty. She turned to Carlyle, a low, guttural sound emanating from her throat. Carlyle, however, showed no fear. He extended a hand, and to the horror of the unseen, Alara tilted her head, a strange, almost curious expression on her corrupted face. "You are a marvel," Carlyle whispered, his voice filled with a chilling awe. "The perfect vessel, the plague's ultimate form." He then did something truly unthinkable. He knelt before the transformed child, his head bowed. "Teach me," he murmured. "Teach me your secrets." From that night forward, Finch Manor became a place of whispered legends. Servants who dared to approach the grounds spoke of unearthly wails and grotesque shadows dancing in the windows. The local villagers, already gripped by fear of the plague, avoided the manor like the pestilence itself. Carlyle Thorne, the physician who sought to understand the plague, had instead become something else entirely. He was no longer a healer, but a devotee. He believed the plague was not merely a disease to be cured, but a higher form of existence, a purification through corruption. He continued his experiments not on the sick, but on the healthy. He would lure desperate souls seeking remedies, promising them cures, only to subject them to his horrifying rituals. He would inject them with the black fluid he extracted from a Lara, watching with rapt attention as the transformation began, the black lines spreading, the humanity draining from their eyes. His notes grew more cryptic, filled with mad ramblings about the ascension, the black sacrament, and the gift of the great mortality. He no longer sought to stop the plague. He sought to spread it, to facilitate its evolution. The transformed beings, his children as he called them, were kept in the manor's hidden chambers, their grotesque forms shambling through the darkness, their guttural growls echoing through the stone walls. They were not mindless monsters. They possessed a terrifying intelligence, a collective consciousness linked to Carlyle, their twisted progenitor. One day, a group of desperate villagers, driven by a combination of fear and suspicion, decided to investigate Finch Manor. They had heard the whispers, seen the strange lights, and felt the chilling aura that emanated from the place. Armed with pitchforks and torches, they stormed the gates. They found the manor eerily silent, the air heavy with a cloying, metallic scent. As they cautiously moved through the halls, they stumbled upon Carlyle's laboratory. The sight that greeted them was enough to curdle their blood. Jars filled with black, viscous fluid lined the shelves. Dissected bodies, their skin a mottled gray, lay on tables. And in the center of the room, surrounded by grotesque diagrams and ancient texts, stood Carlyle, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an unholy light. He was not alone. Behind him, emerging from the shadows, were his children. Their forms were twisted, their limbs elongated, their eyes black and soulless. They moved with a predatory grace, their growls a symphony of horror. The villagers, screaming in terror, turned to flee, but it was too late. The transformed beings, guided by Carlyle's silent command, descended upon them. The manor became a slaughterhouse, filled with the sounds of screams, tearing flesh, and the chilling, guttural growls of the plague's abominations. Carlyle Thorne watched, a serene smile on his face, as his twisted vision unfolded. He had not cured the plague. He had embraced it, nurtured it, and unleashed its true, terrifying potential upon the world. The few villagers who managed to escape carried tales of unspeakable horror, of a doctor who had become a monster, of a plague that walked, and of a manor consumed by darkness. The stories spread like the plague itself, infecting the minds of those who heard them, turning fear into a palpable, living entity. And so, the legend of Master Carlyle Thorne, the Lancet's Shadow, was born. A chilling reminder that in the darkest of times, when humanity is most vulnerable, the true horror may not be the disease itself, but the twisted minds that seek to understand it, and in doing so, become its most terrifying agents. The 16th century, already a brutal age, now had a new nightmare to contend with, a plague not of the body, but of the soul, ushered in by a man who dared to look too deeply into the abyss and found it staring back. The whispers of his name, Carlyle Thorne, would forever be synonymous with the chilling realization that some knowledge is best left undiscovered, some doors best left unopened. For in the pursuit of understanding, he had unleashed an abomination that would forever haunt the shadowed corners of history, a testament to the terrifying consequences of unchecked ambition and a mind consumed by the darkness it sought to conquer. The plague continued its ravages, but now, a new, more insidious terror walked among the living, a legacy of Carlisle Thorne's unholy quest. The very air seemed to thicken with its presence, a silent, unseen threat that transcended mere illness, becoming a living nightmare that preyed upon the very essence of humanity. And in the heart of Finch Manor, amidst the decaying grandeur and the stench of death, Carlisle Thorne, the architect of this new horror, continued his grim work, forever bound to the monstrous creations of his own making. The Lancet's shadow had truly fallen upon the land. The year of our Lord 1487 was etched into Armand du Bois's memory, not by the grand cathedral he was commissioned to design for King Theron, but by the illicit whispers exchanged in shadowed corridors and the feverish touch of Queen Isolde's hand. Armand du Bois, master architect, a man whose hands shaped stone into soaring testaments of faith and power, found himself building a scaffold of his own demise. His life, once a meticulous blueprint of angles and stresses, had become a chaotic sketch, marred by the dangerous curves of forbidden desire. He had arrived at Castle Ravenwood a year prior, a celebrated artisan from the south, his reputation preceding him like a herald. King Theron, a man of imposing stature and an even more imposing temper, had welcomed him with a gruff respect, eager for the new cathedral to outshine all others in the kingdom. But it was Queen Isolde, with her eyes the color of twilight and a spirit caged by her royal duties, who truly captivated Armand. Their initial conversations, ostensibly about architectural aesthetics and the flow of light through stained glass, soon deepened into a clandestine language of longing. Their rendezvous were daring, born of recklessness and a desperate need for connection. The king, often away on hunts or immersed in matters of state, provided the windows of opportunity. Armand, with his intimate knowledge of the castle's labyrinthine passages and hidden nooks, became their guide. The queen's private garden, a forgotten turret chamber, even the echoing crypts beneath the chapel, these became their sanctuaries, each stolen moment a dangerous, intoxicating draught. The scent of jasmine and fear often mingled in those secret places. Armand knew the peril. The penalty for such a transgression was not merely death, but a slow, agonizing public spectacle, a warning etched in blood for all who dared to defy the crown. Yet, the allure of Isolde, the shared vulnerability, the fleeting illusion of freedom, overshadowed the ever-present shadow of discovery. The day the world shattered began innocently enough. Armand was in the great hall, overseeing the placement of a new tapestry depicting a heroic battle. A page, pale and trembling, scurried to him, whispering that the queen requested his presence in her private solar. A thrill, cold and sharp, pierced him. This was unusual. Their meetings were always initiated by him with careful coded messages. He found Isolde not in her solar, but in the antechamber, her face a mask of terror. Her normally vibrant gown seemed dull. Her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles were white. "Armand," she breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. "We are undone. The king. He knows." The words struck him like a physical blow. The air grew thin. The ornate carvings on the walls seemed to sneer. "How?" he managed, his own voice a hollow rasp. "A maid," she choked, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "She saw us in the crypt. She was cleaning, hidden behind a sarcophagus. She confessed to the king this morning." A cold dread, more profound than any fear he had ever known, seeped into his bones. The crypt, their most daring, most dangerous tryst. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He, the master of structures, had chosen a tomb for their love. "You must flee, Armand," Isolde urged, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Now, before he sends for you. He is in a rage, a fury I have never witnessed. He speaks of dismemberment." The word hung in the air, a grotesque promise. Armand's mind raced, a frantic scramble for survival. The castle, his creation, was now his cage. Every archway, every shadowed alcove, every secret passage he had designed, now became potential traps or fleeting avenues of escape. "Where is he?" Armand asked, his eyes darting towards the heavy oak door leading to the main hall. "In his chambers with his advisors. But he will send for you. He will send his guards." Isolde's voice was a desperate plea. "Go through the servants' entrance to the old stables. There is a path through the woods to the abandoned mill. From there you might reach the river." He nodded, a single, decisive movement. There was no time for farewells, no time for regret. Only the primal instinct to survive. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, a desperate goodbye. Then he turned and ran. His boots pounded on the polished stone floors, the sound echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence of the castle. He moved like a ghost, a shadow flitting through familiar halls that now felt alien and hostile. The scent of beeswax and old stone, once comforting, now seemed to mock him. He could almost feel the king's eyes, unseen but omnipresent, burning into his back. He reached the servants' entrance, a narrow, unassuming door tucked away behind the kitchens. The air outside was cold, biting, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of his fear. He burst into the stable yard, startling a few horses that whinnied and shied. He didn't pause, his gaze fixed on the dense tree-line beyond the stables. He plunged into the woods, the undergrowth snagging at his clothes, branches whipping at his face. The path Isolde had spoken of was barely a deer trail, overgrown and treacherous. He stumbled, regained his footing, his lungs burning with exertion. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of ice through him. He imagined the king's soldiers, their heavy armor clanking, their hounds baying, already on his trail. The king, Theron the Stern, was not known for his patience or his mercy. His wrath was a legend whispered in taverns, a force of nature that swept away all in its path. Armand knew that Theron would not rest until he had his vengeance. This wasn't merely about a cuckolded husband. It was about a king's honor, a queen's betrayal, and the brutal assertion of absolute power. He ran until his legs screamed, until his breath came in ragged gasps. The woods grew darker, the trees denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sun, once a distant promise, was now obscured by the thick canopy. He could hear the distant baying of hounds. They were real. The king had unleashed his hunters. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his side, the burning in his lungs. The sound of the hounds grew louder, closer. He could almost feel their hot breath on his heels. He burst out of the woods, stumbling into a clearing. Before him lay the abandoned mill, its skeletal remains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The mill pond, black and still, reflected the last vestiges of twilight. He scrambled down the muddy bank, his eyes scanning for the river. The river was a dark ribbon in the distance. He had to reach it. If he could find a boat, any boat, he might have a chance. But the hounds were too close. He could hear the shouts of men now, the clanking of armor. He ducked into the mill, the decaying wood groaning under his weight. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He scrambled up a rickety ladder to the upper floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through a broken window, he saw them. A dozen soldiers, their torches flickering like malevolent eyes, their hounds straining at their leashes, their muzzles pointed towards the mill. The king himself, a towering figure on a black stallion, sat at the head of the contingent, his face a mask of grim determination. Even from this distance, Armand could feel the intensity of his hatred. "He's in here," a soldier bellowed, his voice echoing through the clearing. Armand knew he was trapped. The mill was a dead end. He looked around frantically, his eyes searching for any possibility, any hidden escape. His gaze fell upon a loose floorboard near the far wall. He remembered the old stories of smugglers using the mill, of secret passages leading to the riverbank. It was a desperate hope, a fleeting prayer. He pried at the board with his bare hands, splinters digging into his flesh. The wood groaned, resisted, then finally gave way. Below, a dark, narrow opening beckoned. He didn't hesitate, scrambling down into the damp earth, the smell of mildew and stagnant water filling his nostrils. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for him to crawl. He moved blindly, his hands scraping against rough-hewn stone and damp earth. He could hear the soldiers entering the mill above him, their heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, their shouts growing louder. "Search everywhere. He cannot have vanished." Theron's voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the mill, a chilling pronouncement of his doom. Armand crawled faster, his mind a maelstrom of fear and desperation. The passage seemed endless, the darkness absolute. He imagined the king's men tearing apart the mill, their frustration mounting, their fury escalating. He could almost feel their hands reaching for him, dragging him back into the light to face the king's brutal justice. Suddenly, the passage opened into a wider cavern. He could hear the faint murmur of water. He was near the river. He scrambled out, gasping for breath, his body aching, his clothes torn and caked with mud. He emerged onto the riverbank, the wide, dark expanse of the river stretching before him. A small, dilapidated fishing boat was tied to a gnarled root, its oars lying haphazardly inside. A miracle. He didn't waste a second, untying the rope with trembling fingers, then scrambling into the boat. He seized the oars, his muscles screaming in protest, and pushed off from the bank. The current caught the boat, pulling it into the darker, faster waters. He rowed with a frantic energy, his eyes fixed on the distant bank, a shadowy line against the horizon. The sounds of the soldiers faded behind him, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the rhythmic creak of the oars. He was free, for now, but the king's reach was long. Armand knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Theron would send riders downriver, dispatch patrols to every village, every inn. He would not rest until Armand was captured, until his honor was avenged. The night was a vast, oppressive blanket. The moon, a sliver of silver, offered little comfort. Armand rode on, his arms burning, his mind a jumble of fear and exhaustion. He thought of Isolde, her terrified face, her desperate plea. Had she been discovered helping him? Would she face the king's wrath as well? The thought was a fresh stab of agony. He rode until dawn, his body a numb shell, his mind a fog of terror. The river widened, the banks becoming less forested, more open. He saw a small, deserted cove and steered the boat towards it, beaching it gently on the muddy shore. He stumbled out, his legs wobbly, and collapsed onto the damp earth, shivering despite the rising sun. He was alive, but for how long? The next few days were a blur of constant movement and gnawing fear. He traveled by night, hiding in haystacks, abandoned barns, and desolate ruins by day. He stole food when he could, a loaf of bread from a baker's cooling rack, a few apples from an orchard. Every shadow seemed to hold a soldier, every distant sound the baying of hounds. His once meticulous mind, accustomed to the precise calculations of stress and load, was now consumed by a single, overriding calculation: survival. He was no longer Armand Dubois, master architect. He was a hunted animal, driven by instinct, his senses heightened to every perceived threat. One evening, seeking shelter in a crumbling shepherd's hut, he overheard a conversation in a nearby village. Two farmers, their voices low and grim, spoke of the king's relentless pursuit. "They say he has offered a king's ransom for the architect's head," one whispered, "and a swift death for anyone who aids him." The words were a fresh wave of terror. The king's fury was not abating. It was intensifying. Armand was a marked man, his face likely plastered on wanted posters in every town square. He continued his desperate flight, heading south, towards the distant mountains, a place where he hoped to lose himself in the vast wilderness. The journey was arduous, his body growing weaker, his spirit frayed. He walked for days without proper rest, his feet raw and bleeding. The king's shadow seemed to stretch across the entire land. He saw patrols on the roads, heard rumors of soldiers searching every hamlet. He felt like a ghost, an unseen presence, yet constantly on the verge of being seen. One particularly dark and stormy night, he was crossing a desolate moor. The wind howled, whipping his tattered clothes, and the rain lashed down, blinding him. He stumbled, falling into a deep ditch, his ankle twisting beneath him with a sickening crack. A scream tore from his throat, swallowed by the wind. Pain, sharp and excruciating, shot up his leg. He lay there, helpless, the rain washing over him, his breath coming in ragged sobs. This was it. He was caught. He heard them then, above the wail of the wind, the distant baying of hounds, closer than ever before. And then, the unmistakable clanking of armor. They had found him. He dragged himself, inch by painful inch, through the mud, trying to find some cover, some refuge. But there was none. The moor was flat, exposed. He was a broken bird, caught in the open. The torches appeared first, flickering through the driving rain, like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Then the silhouettes of men, their figures looming large and menacing. And finally, the king himself, dismounted, his face grim, his eyes burning with an unholy light. Armand Du Bois. Theron's voice cut through the storm, cold and hard as granite. The architect who built his own gallows. Armand tried to scramble away, but his injured ankle screamed in protest. He fell back, his face pressed into the cold, wet earth. He looked up at the king, his face a mask of terror and despair. Theron approached, his heavy boots squelching in the mud. He carried a sword, its polished blade reflecting the flickering torchlight. It was not a ceremonial sword. It was a weapon of war, sharp and deadly. "You dared to defile my queen," Theron hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You dared to spit upon my honor. You, a common artisan, dared to steal what was mine." Armand tried to speak, to plead, but no words came. His throat was dry, constricted by fear. The king raised his sword, its tip glinting in the rain. Armand closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He saw Isolde's face in his mind, her eyes, her smile, her desperate plea for him to flee. A single tear escaped his closed lid, mingling with the rain on his cheek. But the blow didn't come. Instead, he heard a different sound, a chilling guttural growl. He opened his eyes. Theron stood over him, but his gaze was not on Armand. It was fixed on something beyond him in the driving rain. The king's face, usually so composed in its fury, was now contorted in something akin to fear. From the swirling mist and rain, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form indistinct in the gloom. It moved with a strange, jerky gait, its limbs seeming to stretch and contract. It was not human. The soldiers, who had been closing in on Armand, now recoiled, their faces pale with terror. Even the hounds whimpered, cowering at their master's feet. The creature was cloaked, but not in fabric. Its covering seemed to be woven from shadows, shifting and swirling, revealing glimpses of something skeletal beneath. Its head was indistinct, a featureless void, but from it emanated a low, humming sound that vibrated in Armand's very bones. It was the king who broke the silence, his voice a strained whisper. What is that?" The creature took another step forward, its movements unervingly silent despite its size. The air grew colder. The rain seemed to freeze on Armand's skin. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, a chilling presence that transcended any earthly fear. Then the creature spoke. Its voice was not a voice, but a chorus of whispers, a cacophony of ancient, forgotten tongues, all speaking at once, yet forming a single coherent message that resonated directly in Armand's mind, bypassing his ears. "He who seeks vengeance beyond measure invites shadows from the deep." The king, his face ashen, stumbled back. This is not of this world," he choked. The creature's form seemed to grow, its shadowy cloak expanding, engulfing the space around it. The torches flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Your wrath has opened a door that cannot be closed. Armand, despite his terror, felt a strange sense of detachment. This was beyond him, beyond human understanding. The king, the soldiers, the chase, it all seemed trivial in the face of this monstrous entity. The creature turned its featureless head towards Armand. He felt a searing cold pass through him, a touch that seemed to drain the very warmth from his soul. He saw, not with his eyes, but with his mind, a fleeting glimpse of something ancient, something that had existed before time, before kings, before cathedrals. Then the creature focused its attention back on the king. The shadowy cloak swirled, and from its depths, tendrils of darkness reached out, not physical, but ethereal, like grasping fingers of pure night. Theron screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, unlike any sound Armand had ever heard from the proud monarch. The tendrils wrapped around the king, not physically restraining him, but seeming to seep into his very being, draining his vitality, his essence. The king's body began to shrivel, his imposing stature shrinking, his skin turning gray and papery. His eyes, once burning with fury, now held only a desperate, hollow despair. He aged decades in mere seconds, his hair turning white, his face collapsing into a skeletal mask. The soldiers, paralyzed by fear, could only watch in horror as their king was consumed by the encroaching shadows. One by one, they too began to feel the chilling touch of the entity, their own forms wavering, their strength draining. Armand watched, unable to move, unable to look away. The creature was not attacking with violence, but with an insidious, soul-devouring presence. It was a horror beyond comprehension, a consequence of the king's unchecked rage, a manifestation of the darkness he had unleashed. The storm raged, the wind howled like a banshee, and the rain continued to fall, washing over the dying forms of the king and his men. The creature, its form still indistinct, seemed to absorb their life force, growing subtly larger, its hum deepening into a resonant thrum. Finally, with a last shuddering gasp, King Theron collapsed, a withered husk, his sword clattering uselessly in the mud. The soldiers followed, their bodies dissolving into dust as the shadowy tendrils receded back into the creature's form. The creature turned its attention back to Armand. He braced himself, expecting the same fate, but instead, the chorus of whispers returned, softer this time, almost mournful. The architect of his own ruin, and the witness to a truth not meant for mortal eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature began to recede, its shadowy form dissolving into the driving rain and the swirling mist. The cold began to lift, the air returning to its normal chill. The wind softened, the rain lessened, and the moor, once a scene of unimaginable horror, was now merely a desolate, rain-swept landscape. He was free, but the freedom felt like a curse. He carried a secret that would forever haunt his waking hours. Dimp was a creature of habit and of current. His life revolved around the hum of transformers, the crisp snap of circuit breakers, and the satisfying glow of a newly wired fixture. His real name was Archibald P. Dimpleton, but everyone, even his mother, called him Dimp. He was a man of meticulous order, his tools laid out in his van with surgical precision, his work boots always polished, his lunch packed with the same tuna sandwich and apple every day. He wasn't particularly social, preferring the silent, logical puzzles of faulty wiring to the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. His days were a predictable rhythm: wake, coffee, work, dinner, sleep, repeat, until the call came from Blackwood Manor. It was late on a Tuesday, the kind of twilight that bled from bruised purple to inky black, when his old flip phone, a relic he clung to with stubborn affection, buzzed. The caller ID was blocked. Dimp, usually wary of such calls, answered out of a strange, uncharacteristic impulse. "Dimp Electrical Services," he grunted. his voice raspy from a day spent tracing ancient knob and tube in a dusty attic. A voice, thin and reedy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, replied, "Mr. Dimpleton, my name is Elias Thorne. I require your unique expertise at Blackwood Manor. Urgent electrical issues. Very urgent." Dimp frowned. Blackwood Manor. The name alone was a local legend, whispered in hushed tones. An imposing Victorian monstrosity on the outskirts of town, visible only as a skeletal silhouette against the horizon, shrouded by ancient, gnarled oaks. It had been empty for decades, a monument to forgotten tragedies and whispered horrors. No one went near Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor? Dimp repeated, a tremor in his voice he immediately regretted. That place has been condemned for years, Mr. Thorne. No power. It has peculiarities, Mr. Dimpleton, and it requires a very particular hand. A hand that understands the flow, the pulse of a building. I assure you, the compensation will be substantial. The voice paused, and Dimp could almost hear a dry, rasping breath on the other end. Tonight, if possible. Dimp hesitated, every fiber of his logical, risk-averse being screamed no. But the promise of substantial compensation and a prickle of professional curiosity about what kind of peculiarities could plague a condemned, long-abandoned house gnawed at him. He was an electrician, not a ghost hunter. Electrical problems had solutions. All right, Dimp said, surprising himself. Give me the address and directions. It's not exactly on the map. The directions were indeed convoluted, leading him down a winding, overgrown lane that seemed to swallow his headlights whole. The air grew colder, heavier, as he approached. The trees, ancient and skeletal, clawed at the bruised sky. Then, through a gap in the foliage, he saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was even more imposing than he remembered from childhood dares and whispered tales. A hulking, Gothic edifice of dark stone and decaying wood, its myriad windows like vacant, staring eyes. A single, flickering light seemed to emanate from one of the upper floors, a beacon of impossible illumination in the pervasive gloom. Dimp parked his van, the engine sputtering into silence, leaving him in a profound, unsettling quiet. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. He grabbed his heavy toolbox and his trusty headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path through the oppressive darkness. The massive oak front door, studded with rusted iron, creaked open before he even reached it. Elias Thorne stood in the threshold, a gaunt, stooped figure, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He wore a threadbare suit that seemed to hang on his skeletal frame. "Mr. Dimpleton?" Thorne rasped, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "Welcome. Please, come in." The interior of Blackwood Manor was a mausoleum of dust and decay. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike. Cobwebs draped every surface like ancient lace. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long, dancing shadows. "The problem, Mr. Dimpleton," Thorne began, his voice barely above a whisper, "is inconsistent power and strange surges. The house, it has a mind of its own sometimes." Dimp scoffed internally. A mind of its own. He'd seen plenty of ancient wiring that seemed to have a mind of its own, usually a mind bent on self-destruction. "Where's your main panel?" Dimp asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. Thorne led him through a labyrinth of darkened hallways, each one colder than the last. Dimp's headlamp beam danced across peeling wallpaper, faded portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, and furniture draped in white sheets, like shrouded corpses. They finally reached a small, windowless room in the basement. The air here was even heavier, charged with an almost palpable energy. In the center of the room stood an ancient, cast-iron electrical panel, its fuses and switches a bewildering array of antique components. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that writhed on the walls. "This is it," Thorne said, gesturing with a bony hand. It seems to pulse. Sometimes it goes dead. Sometimes it overloads. Dimp approached the panel cautiously. He pulled on his insulated gloves, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the unsettling atmosphere. He opened the panel door. Inside, the wiring was a tangled mess of cloth-wrapped conductors, some frayed, some blackened, all of it far older than any code allowed. But what truly caught his eye was a faint, almost imperceptible blue glow emanating from deep within the panel, behind the main bus bar. It pulsed, faintly, in time with the flickering bulb. "What's that glow?" Dimp asked, pointing with a gloved finger. Thorn's eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to gleam in the dim light. An anomaly. It appeared some time ago. That's when the true problems began. Dimp reached for his multimeter, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tested the voltage, the amperage. The readings were wildly erratic, spiking and dropping with no discernible pattern. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its electrical system a chaotic circulatory network. As he worked, a chill ran down Dimp's spine that had nothing to do with the drafty basement. He heard it then, faint at first, a whisper like static electricity. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, guttural murmur that was almost, but not quite, words. Just the old house settling, Dimp muttered to himself, trying to sound convincing. Then his wrench, which he had set down on a dusty workbench, slid slowly across the surface, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Dimp froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the wrench, then at Thorn, who stood perfectly still, his face impassive. "Did you see that?" Dimp asked, his voice tight. "See what, Mr. Dimpleton?" Thorn's voice was flat, devoid of surprise. Dimp shook his head. He must be tired, or the strange atmosphere of the house was getting to him. He picked up the wrench, his hand trembling slightly. He spent the next few hours meticulously tracing circuits, testing connections, trying to make sense of the electrical chaos. The blue glow behind the panel intensified, now a steady, unnerving throb. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. They sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, murmuring in a language he couldn't comprehend. At one point, as he was examining a particularly corroded junction box, the bare bulb above him suddenly exploded with a deafening pop, showering him with glass shards. Dimp cried out, stumbling back. He instinctively shielded his eyes. When he looked up, the room was plunged into total darkness, save for the eerie blue pulse from the panel. What in God's name was that? Dimp gasped, his headlamp suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. Thorn's voice came from the darkness, closer than Dimp expected. "The house, it doesn't like to be probed too deeply, Mr. Dimpleton. It resists." Dimp's rational mind was screaming. This wasn't just old wiring. This was something else. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He wanted to run, to sprint out of Blackwood Manor and never look back. But his electrician's pride and a perverse sense of duty kept him rooted. He had a job to do. He shone his headlamp into the open panel. The blue glow was now almost blinding, radiating an unnatural heat. He could see faint, ephemeral shapes swirling within the light, like smoke in a jar. And the whispers, they were clearer now, distinct voices, though still fragmented and distorted. He heard a woman scream, a child's sob, a man's guttural curse. They were sounds of terror, of pain. "What is this place?" Dimp whispered, his voice barely audible. Thorn stepped into the beam of his headlamp, his face illuminated in the stark light. His eyes were wide, almost manic. This house, Mr. Dimpleton, was built on a ley line, a powerful conduit of natural energy. And over the years it has absorbed, it has become a vessel for the residual energies, the echoes, the souls. Dimp felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Souls? Mr. Thorn, I'm an electrician, not an exorcist. But you understand current, Mr. Dimpleton? Thorn said, his voice rising, a strange excitement in his tone. You understand how energy flows, how it can be harnessed. The blue light, it is the nexus, the point where the energies converge. I believe it can be controlled. Dimp stared at him, horrified. Controlled? What are you talking about? The power, Mr. Dimpleton. Thorn's voice was now a feverish whisper, the raw, untamed power within these walls. I have been trying to stabilize it, to direct it, to communicate. As Thorn spoke, the blue light pulsed faster, brighter. The whispers coalesced into a cacophony of screams and moans. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost unbearable static. Dimp's hair stood on end. He felt a tingling sensation on his skin, like 1,000 tiny needles. Suddenly, a surge of raw electrical energy shot through the panel. Dimp cried out as a jolt ripped through his body, despite his insulated gloves. He was thrown back, slamming against the dusty wall. His headlamp clattered to the floor, plunging the room into near-total darkness again, illuminated only by the frantic, blinding blue flashes from the panel. He lay there, stunned, his muscles spasming. He could hear Thorn laughing, a dry, cackling sound that filled the room. It responds. Thorn shrieked. It responds to the will. It recognizes the conduit. Dimp pushed himself up, his body aching. He saw Thorn standing before the panel, his arms outstretched, his face bathed in the pulsing blue light. He was muttering, chanting something in a language Dimp didn't recognize, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The wires in the panel began to writhe, sparking violently. The blue light pulsed with incredible intensity, now a solid, blinding beacon. Dimp saw the ephemeral shapes within the light coalesce, forming indistinct, spectral figures, their faces contorted in agony. They reached out, their translucent hands clawing at the air. He's trying to control them, Dimp realized, a horrifying clarity washing over him. He's trying to channel the dead. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to stop this. He was an electrician. This was an electrical problem, albeit one of a terrifying, supernatural nature. He scrambled for his tools, his hands fumbling in the near darkness. He found his heavy-duty wire cutters. He had to cut the main power, to sever the connection. As he moved towards the panel, a spectral hand, cold as ice, brushed against his cheek. He flinched, stumbling. The whispers were now screams, echoing directly in his mind, a chorus of tormented voices. "Stop him!" they shrieked. "Stop him! He feeds on US." Thorn turned, his eyes blazing with an unholy light. "You interfere, Mr. Dimpleton. You will be absorbed. You will join them." He lunged at Dimp, his bony fingers outstretched, crackling with faint blue energy. Dimp, fueled by a primal fear, dodged the attack. He raised his wire cutters, aiming for the main conduit, the thickest cable leading into the glowing nexus. Thorn shrieked, a sound of pure rage and frustration. He threw himself at Dimp again, but Dimp was faster. With a desperate heave, he brought the cutters down. Crack! A deafening explosion ripped through the basement. The blue light flared blindingly, then died. The screams of the spectral figures faded into a long, drawn-out wail that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Dimp's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. He lay there for a long moment, trembling, his body aching, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He slowly pushed himself up, fumbling for his headlamp. When its beam finally cut through the darkness, he saw the panel. It was charred, smoking, the wires severed, twisted, and melted. The blue glow was gone, and Thorn was gone. There was no trace of him, no body, no ash, nothing. Just a faint, lingering scent of ozone and something else, something burnt and acrid. Dimp stumbled out of the basement, his legs like jelly. He didn't bother to close the panel, didn't bother to collect his other tools. He just needed to get out. He ran through the dark, silent hallways, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly. He didn't look back at the portraits, didn't listen for whispers. He burst out of the front door, gasping for air, the cold night air a welcome shock against his burning lungs. He scrambled into his van, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. He slammed the van into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and sped down the overgrown lane, not daring to glance in his rearview mirror. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and Blackwood Manor. He finally pulled over on the side of a deserted highway, the first faint hint of dawn painting the eastern sky. He sat there, shivering, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a terrifying, impossible film. He had seen things, heard things, felt things that defied all logic, all reason. He, Dimp, the meticulous, rational electrician, had faced the supernatural and he had survived. But he was changed, forever. The hum of transformers no longer sounded comforting. The snap of circuit breakers made him flinch. Every flickering light, every unexplained power surge, sent a jolt of primal fear through him. He saw shadows in the corners of his vision, heard faint whispers on the wind. He never took another call for an old house. He stuck to modern, predictable wiring, to the safe, logical flow of current. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the power lines hummed outside his window, he swore he could still see the faint, pulsing blue glow. And he knew with chilling certainty that the current that flowed through the world, the current he had dedicated his life to understanding, held secrets far darker, far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And sometimes he wondered if a part of Elias Thorne, a part of the tormented souls of Blackwood Manor, hadn't been absorbed into the very fabric of the electrical grid, waiting for the right conduit, the right surge to unleash themselves once more. And Dimp, the electrician, would always be listening for the hum, the whisper, the current that kills. The old man, Arthur Finch, had always found solace in the woods. Not the manicured parks with their paved paths and cheerful dog walkers, but the true, untamed wilderness that began where the last farm road crumbled into a forgotten track. At 82, his steps were slower, his breath shallower, but his eyes still held the keen, observant glint of a man who had spent a lifetime noticing the subtle shifts in nature. Today, however, the woods felt different. A chill, not of the autumn air, but of something far more ancient, seemed to seep into his bones. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the highest pines, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. Arthur had intended a short walk, just to the old stone wall that marked the edge of the abandoned homestead, but a strange compulsion had urged him deeper. He told himself it was the lure of a rare mushroom, or perhaps a glimpse of the elusive great horned owl he'd heard calling last night. But deep down, a tremor of unease stirred. The path, usually distinct, seemed to braid and unravel before him, the familiar landmarks subtly altered. A fallen log he remembered as being on his left was now on his right, its mossy back like a slumbering beast. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. He paused, his gnarled hand going to the walking stick that had been his constant companion for decades. The wood, usually warm and comforting, felt cold, almost vibrating with a low hum he could feel more than hear. A sound, faint at first, then growing, reached his ears. It was a whisper, carried on a breeze that wasn't there. Not the rustle of leaves or the creak of branches, but a sibilant, multi-layered murmur, like 1,000 hushed voices speaking just beyond the edge of comprehension. Arthur strained his hearing, his brow furrowed. Was it the wind playing tricks? Or was his old mind finally succumbing to the solitude? He pressed on, drawn by an invisible current. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a perpetual twilight. The ground underfoot became softer, a carpet of decaying leaves and needles that muffled his steps. The whispers intensified, weaving in and out of each other, sometimes seeming to form fragments of words, then dissolving into unintelligible murmurs. Lost! He thought he heard, or perhaps cold. A sudden snap of a twig behind him made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. Nothing, only the silent, watchful trees. He chided himself. Old age was making him jumpy, but the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking his every move, was growing stronger, pressing in on him from all sides. He remembered a story his grandmother used to tell of the whispering ones who dwelled in the deepest parts of the forest, spirits of those who had lost their way and never found peace. He dismissed it as a child's tale, but now, in the deepening gloom, it felt chillingly real. The path vanished entirely. Arthur found himself pushing through thickets of thorny bushes, their branches snagging at his worn jacket. He stumbled, catching himself on a rough tree trunk. His breath hitched. Embedded in the bark at eye level was a small, crudely carved wooden effigy. It was a human figure, faceless, with outstretched arms, its form twisted as if in agony. Its eyes, though absent, seemed to bore into him. A cold dread seeped into him, colder than the autumn air. This was no ordinary walk. He was no longer on a familiar path. He was in a place that did not want him there. He turned to retrace his steps, but the way he had come was now indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. Every tree looked the same, every shadow held the same menacing quality. Panic, a cold, sharp claw, began to scratch at the edges of his composure. He, Arthur Finch, who had never been lost in these woods, was lost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around him like an invisible fog. He could almost make out individual voices now, thin and reedy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. They seemed to call his name or a distorted version of it. Arthur, Arthur Finch. He started to walk faster, his old legs protesting, stumbling over roots and rocks. He had to get out. He had to find the road, the familiar world. But the woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for him. He saw another effigy, then another, scattered among the trees, each one more disturbing than the last. Some were half buried in the earth, others hung from branches, swaying almost imperceptibly in the still air. They were warnings, he realized, or perhaps markers. Markers of what? A sudden, piercing shriek tore through the air. Not human, not animal, but something in between. A sound that scraped against the very marrow of his bones. Arthur cried out, stumbling back against a tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slid to the ground, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror. From the shadows between the trees, shapes began to emerge. Not solid forms, but shifting, ethereal figures, like smoke given a semblance of humanity. They were tall and gaunt, their limbs impossibly long, their movements fluid and unnatural. They had no distinct features, only dark, hollow spaces where eyes should be, and mouths that seemed to stretch into silent screams. The whispers coalesced into a chorus, a cacophony of sorrow and malice. He understood now. These were the whispering ones, and they were not just spirits of the lost. They were the ones who caused people to become lost. He tried to scramble to his feet, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed by fear, a primal terror that stripped away years of experience and resilience. The figures drifted closer, their silent forms radiating an unbearable cold. He could feel their presence, a pressure on his chest, stealing his breath. One of them, taller than the rest, glided directly in front of him. It reached out a long, skeletal arm, its hand dissolving into mist as it approached. Arthur felt an icy touch on his forehead, a sensation that felt like his very thoughts were being drawn out of him. He saw flashes of memory. His wife's smile, the laughter of his children, the warmth of his home. They were fading, dissolving into the swirling mist around the creature's hand. He was being emptied, his essence being absorbed. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His vision blurred, the trees spinning around him. The whispers became a roar, a deafening symphony of despair. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, for the final erasure. Then a distant sound. faint at first but growing stronger. The insistent, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a helicopter. The ethereal figures recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. The roar of the whispers faltered, replaced by a collective, frustrated hiss. The icy touch on his forehead vanished. Arthur opened his eyes. The figures were retreating, dissolving back into the shadows, their forms becoming less distinct, more like wisps of smoke. The oppressive cold began to recede, replaced by the crisp autumn air. The helicopter's sound grew louder, closer, the rhythmic beat of its blades cutting through the silence of the woods. A searchlight beam pierced the gloom, sweeping through the trees. He heard shouts, human voices, filled with concern and relief. "Arthur, Mr. Finch." He tried to call back, but his voice was still a raspy whisper. He managed to wave a trembling hand. Moments later, the search party broke through the undergrowth. 2 local deputies and his worried neighbor, Martha, her face etched with fear. They rushed to his side, their flashlights illuminating his pale, shaken face. "Mr. Finch, are you all right? We've been looking for you for hours," Martha exclaimed, her voice trembling. Arthur tried to speak, to tell them what he had seen, what he had felt. But the words wouldn't form. How could he explain the faceless figures, the soul-sucking cold, the whispers that had called his name? They would think he was senile, that the woods had finally broken his mind. He simply nodded, allowing them to help him to his feet. His legs felt like jelly, but the terror was slowly receding, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. As they led him out of the deepest part of the woods, back towards the faint glow of civilization, he glanced back. The trees stood silent and still, their shadows long and unmoving. There was no sign of the effigies, no lingering chill, no whispers. It was as if it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the encroaching darkness. But he knew what he had seen. The woods had shown him something ancient and terrible, something that preyed on the lost and the vulnerable. He never walked in those woods again. The solace he once found there had been replaced by a deep, abiding fear. And sometimes, on a quiet night when the wind rustled through the leaves outside his window, he could still hear them. The whispers, always the whispers. Dr. Stephanie Thorne was a surgeon, a woman who held lives in her hands with the precision of a master artisan and the unwavering focus of a predator. Her operating room, a sterile, brightly lit sanctuary, was her domain. For years, it had been a place of triumphs, of organs mended, diseases excised, and futures restored. Yet lately, the sanctuary had begun to feel more like a tomb, and she, its sole haunted occupant. It started subtly, as most insidious things do, a flicker in the periphery of her vision during a late-night chart review, a cold spot in the scrub room even when the air conditioning was off, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of formaldehyde mixed with something else, something sickly sweet, like decay and lilies. Stephanie, a woman of science and logic, dismissed them as fatigue, the stresses of a demanding profession, perhaps even the lingering phantom sensations of a particularly grueling shift. But then came the whispers. Soft, indistinct at first, like the rustle of surgical gowns or the distant hum of monitors. They would coalesce when she was alone, in the quiet hours before dawn, or in the hushed sanctity of her office. "Why, doctor?" A child's voice, thin and reedy, once seemed to sigh from the empty chair opposite her desk. "Why couldn't you?" The sentence always trailed off, leaving an echoing void in her chest. Her first true patient failure had been a decade ago. A young girl, Lily, with a congenital heart defect. Stephanie, then a fresh resident, had been assisting in the complex repair. A sudden, unexpected arrhythmia, a frantic scramble, the flatline. Lily's parents, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room, had haunted Stephanie's dreams for years. Now, Lily's small, pale face, framed by wisps of blonde hair, would sometimes appear in the reflection of the scrub room mirror, her eyes wide and accusatory. Stephanie would blink, and she was gone, replaced by her own tired, guilt-ridden reflection. The guilt was a constant, gnawing companion, a parasite that fed on her triumphs and amplified her failures. Every successful surgery was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of peace before the inevitable return of the shadows. She had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives, but it was the ones she hadn't, the ones who had slipped through her fingers like grains of sand, that truly mattered to the growing darkness within her. There was Mr. Henderson, a jovial, retired carpenter who had come in for a routine bypass, a sudden, massive pulmonary embolism post-op. Stephanie had been off call, at home, sleeping soundly while her patient coded. She had woken to the phone call, the frantic voice of the attending, the chilling finality of the words. "He's gone, Stephanie. We lost him." Now, the rhythmic, hollow thump-thump of a carpenter's hammer would sometimes echo through the deserted hospital corridors when she walked them alone, a phantom sound that resonated with the beat of her own failing heart. She'd find sawdust on her pristine white coat, even after it had been laundered, a fine, golden dust that clung to the fabric like a curse. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, became another arena for her torment. The silence of her spacious living room would be punctuated by the faint, rattling cough of Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman with advanced lung cancer whose last breath had been drawn under Stephanie's care, despite all efforts. Mrs. Rodriguez had held Stephanie's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Thank you for trying, doctor." But Stephanie knew, in the deepest recesses of her soul, that trying hadn't been enough. Now, the scent of lavender, Mrs. Rodriguez's favorite perfume, would fill her bedroom, thick and cloying, making it difficult to breathe. She'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced she could feel the faint, papery touch of an old hand on her arm. The operating room, however, was where the horror truly blossomed. The sterile environment, designed for life-saving, became a stage for the spectral. During a complex abdominal surgery, as she meticulously sutured, the overhead lights would flicker, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort into grotesque faces. The gentle hum of the anesthesia machine would morph into a low, mournful moan. The scrub nurse, oblivious, would ask, "Everything all right, doctor?" And Stephanie would force a tight smile, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. One night, operating on a young man who had been in a terrible car accident, the air in the OR grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. As she made an incision, a sudden, icy gust of wind swept through the room, despite the sealed environment. The surgical instruments on the tray clattered, and a scalpel, seemingly of its own volition, slid precariously close to the edge. Stephanie's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced up, and there, standing at the foot of the operating table, shrouded in a shimmering, translucent haze, was a figure. It was tall, gaunt, its face obscured by shadow, but she knew him. It was Mr. Davies, a patient from years ago who had died on the table due to an unforeseen allergic reaction to the anesthetic. His voice, a guttural rasp, echoed in her mind, not in her ears. "You promised, doctor. You promised you'd save me." Stephanie froze, scalpel hovering. Her hands were slick with sweat, not from exertion, but from sheer terror. The attending anesthesiologist, noticing her sudden stillness, asked, "Dr. Thorne, is something wrong?" Stephanie shook her head, forcing herself to focus, to push the spectral image away. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced psychosis. It had to be, but the manifestations grew bolder, more personal. They knew her weaknesses, her deepest fears. They knew the exact moments of her failures, replaying them with chilling accuracy. During a quiet moment between cases, she saw a replay of Lily's flatline on the monitor screen, the jagged green line straightening into an agonizingly flat expanse, the sound of the machine's death knell echoing in the empty OR. She heard Mr. Henderson's booming laugh, suddenly cut short by a strangled gasp. She felt the phantom weight of Mrs. Rodriguez's hand, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Her colleagues noticed her decline, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she flinched at sudden noises. Stephanie, you need a break. Her chief of surgery, Dr. Miller, advised gently. You're burning out. I'm fine, dear. Miller, she'd insist, her voice strained. Just a few tough cases. But she wasn't fine. She was unraveling. Sleep offered no escape. Her nightmares were vivid, terrifying reenactments of her patients' deaths, with her always at the center, helpless, failing. She saw their faces, contorted in pain, in fear, in the blankness of death. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, accused her. One particularly harrowing night, she was preparing for an emergency appendectomy. As she scrubbed, the water from the faucet turned icy cold, then scalding hot, then a viscous, reddish-brown. She stared, horrified, as the water swirled down the drain, leaving behind a faint, metallic scent. She looked up at the mirror, and instead of her own reflection, she saw a montage of her failed patients, their faces superimposed over hers, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes filled with an eternal, unforgiving sorrow. Lily, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Davies, and countless others whose names she had tried to bury deep within her subconscious. You let us down, doctor. A chorus of voices whispered, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. You failed us. She stumbled back, hitting the wall, her breath catching in her throat. No, she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I tried. God, I tried. Trying wasn't enough. Lily's reedy voice echoed, clearer now, closer. You could have done more. You should have done more. The words pierced her, sharper than any scalpel. They were the very words she had whispered to herself in the darkest hours of the night. The guilt, a festering wound, now felt like a physical entity, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She began to self-medicate, first with over-the-counter sleep aids, then with stronger prescription pills. The pills dulled the edges, but they didn't silence the voices or banish the specters. They only made her more detached, more prone to mistakes. During a routine gallbladder removal, her hand slipped. The patient, a young woman, cried out in pain. Stephanie's vision blurred, the image of Mr. Davies' gaunt face flashing before her eyes. The nurse quickly stepped in, steadying her hand, guiding her. Are you okay, doctor? Stephanie nodded, her face pale. She finished the surgery, but the incident shook her to her core. She was a danger to her patients now. The very people she swore to protect were at risk because of her crumbling sanity. She started seeing a therapist, a kind, elderly woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed. Stephanie spoke of stress, of burnout, of the immense pressure of her job. She skirted around the supernatural, terrified of being labeled delusional. Dr. Reed listened patiently, offering coping mechanisms, suggesting a sabbatical. You carry a heavy burden, Stephanie? Dr. Reed said one session, her voice gentle. The lives you save and the lives you lose. It's an immense responsibility, but you are only human. You cannot save everyone. But I should have, Stephanie whispered, the words tearing at her throat. I could have, if I had been faster, if I had seen it coming. The what-ifs were a tormenting litany, chanted by the unseen choir of her failed patients. One evening, after a particularly draining day, Stephanie found herself alone in the hospital's deserted recovery ward. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow. She walked past the empty beds, each one a stark white canvas for her memories. As she passed one, she heard a faint, shallow breath. She stopped, her heart seizing. A young boy, no older than 10, lay in the bed, his chest barely rising and falling. His face was pale, his lips blue. It was Michael, a boy she had operated on for a ruptured appendix, only for him to succumb to sepsis days later. Doctor, Michael whispered, his eyes opening, wide and unblinking, fixed on her. It hurts, doctor. Why did you let it hurt so much? Stephanie fell to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her face. Michael, she choked out, reaching for him. Her hand passed through his ethereal form. I'm so sorry. I tried everything. I truly did. But it wasn't enough, he said, his voice growing stronger, colder. You didn't fight hard enough. You gave up. No, she cried, shaking her head violently. I never gave up. I fought for you, Michael. I fought for all of you. The room grew cold, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and despair. The other beds in the ward slowly began to fill. Lily, her small, pale hand reaching out. Mr. Henderson, his chest convulsing with a silent, hacking cough. Mrs. Rodriguez, her eyes clouded with a distant, sorrowful gaze. Mr. Davies, his spectral form towering over her, his eyes burning holes into her soul. A cacophony of whispers filled the room, a swirling vortex of accusations and regrets. My heart, my breath, my life. You took it. You let it go. Stephanie covered her ears, screaming, "Stop it. Please, stop it. I can't take it anymore." But they didn't stop. They pressed in, their spectral forms coalescing, their voices rising to a deafening roar. She felt their cold touches, their phantom breaths on her skin. The guilt, a tangible weight, crushed her. She ran. She ran blindly through the deserted hospital, the whispers chasing her, the ghostly figures flitting in her periphery. She burst out of the hospital doors, gasping for air, the cool night air a shock against her burning skin. She didn't stop running until she reached her apartment, collapsing onto her living room floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The next morning, Stephanie didn't go to work. She called in sick, something she rarely did. She spent the day huddled in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the lights off, trying to escape the pervasive sense of dread. But the haunting had followed her. The scent of lilies, formaldehyde, and lavender mingled in the air. The faint sounds of hammering, coughing, and flatlining monitors echoed from every corner. She knew with a chilling certainty that this wasn't just burnout. This wasn't just stress. She was being haunted, and the ghosts weren't just the dead. They were the manifestations of her own unbearable guilt. She considered leaving medicine, abandoning the career she had dedicated her life to. But the thought brought a fresh wave of despair. What else was there? This was all she knew, all she had ever wanted to be. A healer, a lifesaver. But she had become a life-taker, or so her tormentors insisted. Days turned into weeks. Stephanie became a recluse, venturing out only for groceries. Her once vibrant spirit dimmed, her eyes hollow. The ghosts were constant companions now, their presence a dull ache, sometimes flaring into sharp, terrifying manifestations. They didn't just accuse her. They reminded her of the joy they had lost, the futures that had been stolen. Lily's laughter, Mr. Henderson's booming stories, Mrs. Rodriguez's gentle humming, Michael's innocent questions. All gone, all because of her perceived failures. One evening, as she sat in the dark, staring at the flickering television screen, a thought, cold and clear, pierced through the fog of her despair. She couldn't escape them. Not in her apartment, not at the hospital, not even in her dreams. They were a part of her now, inextricably linked to her guilt. There was only one way to truly silence them. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely comforting. A way out, a way to finally rest. She walked into her bathroom, her steps heavy, deliberate. She opened the medicine cabinet, her fingers brushing against the familiar bottles. The pills that had offered temporary oblivion now seemed to beckon with a promise of eternal peace. As she reached for the bottle, a shimmering form materialized in the mirror. It was Lily, her small face filled not with accusation, but with a profound sadness. Behind her, other faces emerged, their expressions mirroring Lily's. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Rodriguez, Michael. They weren't screaming. They weren't accusing. They looked heartbroken. "Don't, Doctor." Lily's voice, soft and clear, echoed in the silent bathroom. "Don't give up. Not like this." Stephanie froze, her hand hovering over the pills. "But you hate me," she whispered, her voice raw. "You blame me." "We don't hate you. Mr. Henderson's voice rumbled, a deep, sorrowful sound. We were just lost, and you were the last one we saw. Your guilt is your own prison, Doctor, Mrs. Rodriguez added, her voice a gentle sigh. We are merely echoes of it. Michael's small hand, translucent and shimmering, reached out and seemed to brush her cheek. You tried, Doctor. You really did. The accusations faded, replaced by a wave of profound, heartbreaking empathy. They weren't there to punish her, not truly. They were reflections of her own self-condemnation. Her guilt had given them form, had given them voice. Stephanie stared at their faces in the mirror, their ethereal forms slowly fading, their expressions shifting from sorrow to a faint, almost imperceptible understanding. The room, though still cold, no longer felt oppressive. The scents, though lingering, no longer suffocated. She slowly lowered her hand, pulling it away from the medicine bottle. The peace she had sought in oblivion now seemed possible through a different path. Forgiveness. Not from them, but from herself. It wouldn't be easy. The echoes wouldn't vanish overnight. The guilt was too deeply ingrained. But for the first time in a long time, Stephanie saw a glimmer of hope. She had to learn to live with her failures, to accept that she was human, that she couldn't save everyone. She had to forgive herself for trying her best and still falling short. She turned away from the mirror, leaving the pills untouched. The apartment was still dark, but the overwhelming sense of dread had lessened. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtains, letting the first slivers of dawn light filter into the room. The ghosts might always be there, lingering in the corners of her vision, whispering in the quiet moments. But perhaps, if she could find a way to forgive herself, their voices would become less accusatory and more like distant, sorrowful reminders. Reminders to always try her best, but also to remember her own humanity. And perhaps, just perhaps, the echoes in the operating room would one day transform from cries of despair into quiet murmurs of peace. The scent of turpentine and old oil paint clung to Joffrey like a second skin, a comforting, familiar shroud that had defined his existence for decades. His studio, a cavernous attic space in a forgotten corner of the city, was a testament to his life's work. Canvases stacked like forgotten tombstones, brushes bristling in terracotta pots, and the ever-present, almost living, hum of his own creative energy. Joffrey was an artist, not a celebrated one, but a true one, who poured his soul onto canvas, seeking to capture the elusive essence of beauty, pain, and the grotesque. Lately, however, his muse had taken a darker turn. It began subtly, with the shadows in his portraits deepening, the smiles of his subjects twisting into something less than benevolent. He dismissed it as a new phase, a natural evolution of his artistic voice. But then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of old leaves outside his window. They gradually coalesced into distinct, insidious suggestions. They spoke of colors he'd never seen, forms that defied geometry, and a truth lurking beneath the veneer of reality that only he, Joffrey, was destined to unveil. His current project was a large, ambitious piece, a landscape of a desolate moor he'd visited years ago. He remembered the wind whipping across the heather, the sky a bruised purple, the ancient stones standing like silent sentinels. But as he painted, the moor began to shift. The stones seemed to writhe, their surfaces rippling with unseen currents. The sky bled into a sickly green, and the heather, instead of purple, pulsed with an unsettling, visceral red. The whispers grew louder, urging him on, praising his vision, condemning his doubts. Sleep became a luxury Joffrey could no longer afford. When he did drift off, his dreams were a maelstrom of distorted faces, screaming colors, and the relentless echo of the whispers. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to stumble back to the easel, compelled by an invisible force. His hands, once steady and precise, now trembled with a manic energy, applying paint with a furious, almost violent, abandon. His few friends, mostly fellow struggling artists, noticed the change. His normally meticulous appearance gave way to paint-splattered clothes and unkempt hair. His eyes, once bright with artistic fervor, were now sunken and bloodshot, darting nervously as if tracking unseen entities. They tried to intervene to suggest rest, a break, perhaps even a doctor. Joffrey merely laughed, a hollow, rasping sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You don't understand," he'd croak. "I'm on the precipice of something monumental. They're showing me the way." The they he referred to were the voices, now constant companions, guiding his brushstrokes, dictating his palette. They told him the moor wasn't just a landscape. It was a living, breathing entity, a gateway to a realm beyond human comprehension. They told him the red wasn't just paint. It was the lifeblood of the earth, spilled by ancient, forgotten rituals. They told him the writhing stones were not stones at all, but petrified beings, trapped between dimensions. His masterpiece, once a landscape, was transforming into something monstrous. The canvas, once flat, seemed to bulge and recede in places, as if the very fabric of it were alive. The colors, once vibrant, now seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of oppressive darkness. The central feature, what was once a cluster of standing stones, had morphed into a gaping maw, its jagged edges lined with what looked disturbingly like teeth. Joffrey worked feverishly, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink. His body became a mere vessel for the unholy vision that consumed him. The whispers had evolved into a chorus, a cacophony of voices that shrieked and sang, laughed and wept, all urging him deeper into the abyss. He no longer questioned their origin, their sanity. They were his truth, his only reality. One evening, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the studio in an eerie, blood-orange glow, Joffrey stepped back from the canvas. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. It was finished. The painting pulsed with an unholy energy, a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shapes. The maw in the center seemed to draw in the very air around him, and from its depths, he heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the canvas. Felt warm, almost hot, beneath his fingertips. A jolt, like an electric shock, coursed through his arm, and he snatched his hand back. But the connection had been made. The painting wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a window, a portal, and something was stirring on the other side. The growl intensified, becoming a roar that filled the studio, shaking the very foundations of the old building. The colors on the canvas swirled faster, coalescing, solidifying. Joffrey watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the maw began to expand, tearing at the canvas itself, ripping through the threads with a sound like tearing flesh. A black, viscous tendril snaked out of the opening, dripping a corrosive fluid onto the floorboards, which hissed and smoked. Then another and another, until a dozen such appendages writhed in the air, seeking purchase. Joffrey stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old sketches, his mind screaming in a silent, primal terror. From the expanding void, a form began to emerge. It was amorphous, shifting, a nightmare made manifest. Eyes, countless and unblinking, opened across its surface, reflecting the dim light of the studio with an alien malevolence. It was the creature the whispers had promised, the entity that resided beyond the veil, and Joffrey, in his madness, had given it a door. The air in the studio grew heavy, thick with an unbearable pressure. The stench of ozone and decay filled his nostrils, burning his throat. The creature, now fully emerged, towered over him, its form defying all logic, its presence a violation of every natural law. It was a living, breathing canvas of pure horror, and Joffrey realized, with a chilling clarity, that he was its first and perhaps only audience. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his parched throat. He wanted to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended fear. The creature extended one of its tendrils, slow and deliberate, towards him. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a predator savoring its prey. As the tendril touched his forehead, a searing pain erupted in his skull, followed by a torrent of images, memories, and sensations that were not his own. He saw cosmic horrors, vast, indifferent entities lurking in the void between stars. He saw worlds consumed, realities unmade, and the chilling, eternal silence that followed. He saw the true face of the universe, and it was a face of absolute, unfeeling chaos. His mind, already frayed, snapped. The whispers, the voices, the delusions, all coalesced into a single, deafening shriek of pure, unadulterated madness. He felt his identity dissolve, his sanity unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the raw, screaming nerve endings of his being. When his friends, concerned by his prolonged silence, finally broke down the studio door days later, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The studio was a ruin, furniture overturned, canvases shredded. The air was still thick with the acrid stench of something alien and foul. And in the center of the room, before the ruined, pulsating canvas, sat Joffrey. He was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless, guttural melody. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at nothing, yet seemed to see everything. His hands, once instruments of creation, now clawed at the air, as if trying to grasp at the unseen horrors that still danced before his shattered mind. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, yet etched upon it was also a strange, disturbing smile. The painting was gone, or rather, what remained of it was an impossible void, a tear in the fabric of reality that shimmered faintly before their eyes. They tried to speak to him, to reach him, but Joffrey was beyond their grasp. He was trapped in his own canvas of madness, a masterpiece of horror he had unwittingly created, and from which there would be no escape. The Whispers had finally claimed him, and in their victory, they had left behind only an empty shell, a monument to an artist who had dared to look too deeply into the abyss and found it staring back. The studio, once a sanctuary of art, was now a tomb of sanity, forever haunted by the echoes of Joffrey's descent. The old Ashworth estate stood on a hill overlooking the town, a skeletal silhouette against the perpetually bruised twilight sky. Locals whispered tales of its former inhabitants, a family consumed by a madness that culminated in a fiery, unexplained end. For our group, Ethan, Chloe, Ben, and me, Sarah, it was the perfect stage for our most ambitious prank yet. We were notorious for our elaborate scares. Last Halloween, we convinced Ben his car was possessed by rigging the horn to blare randomly and the wipers to flail wildly. He nearly crashed into a mailbox. But tonight, we were targeting Ethan, the unflappable leader, the one who always scoffed at ghost stories. Our plan was simple. Convince him Ashworth Estate was truly haunted. "You sure about this, guys?" Chloe's voice was a nervous tremor, barely audible over the crunch of dead leaves under our boots. She clutched a flashlight, its beam dancing erratically. "My grandma says people who go in there, they don't come out the same." Ben, ever the pragmatist, scoffed. "Your grandma also thinks the mailman is a vampire, Chloe. It's an abandoned house. Creepy? Sure, but nothing a few strategically placed speakers and some fishing line can't handle." I adjusted the backpack containing our arsenal of scare tactics. A portable speaker loaded with blood-curdling screams, a fog machine, a remote-controlled toy spider, and a sheet for the classic ghost reveal. "Relax, Chloe. It's just Ethan. He needs to be taken down a peg." Ethan, oblivious, was already at the crumbling front door, a mischievous grin on his face. "All right, chickens, who's going first? Or should I just go in and clear out all the ghosts for you?" He pushed the door open with a dramatic creak. A blast of stale, musty air, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, hit us. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the last vestiges of the setting sun. "Okay, Ethan, you're the brave one," I said, trying to sound casual. "You lead. We'll follow." He chuckled, stepping into the void. Piece of cake. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of our flashlights, illuminated by the occasional sliver of moonlight piercing through broken windows. Cobwebs draped from the high ceilings like morbid chandeliers. The air was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on us. Every floorboard groaned underfoot. Every distant creak amplified in the silence. Our plan was to guide Ethan through the ground floor, setting off small scares, a sudden bang, a whispered voice, a fleeting shadow, before the grand finale in the old ballroom. Ben was in charge of the sound effects from his phone, connected to the speaker. Chloe would handle the fog machine and the spider. I was the ghost. We moved deeper. The first scare was a success. Ben triggered a low, guttural growl from the speaker as Ethan passed a dark alcove. Ethan jumped, spun around, and then laughed. Very funny, Ben. You'll have to do better than that. Next, Chloe released the toy spider, sending it scuttling across the dusty floor towards Ethan's feet. He yelped, then kicked it, sending it skittering under a pile of rubble. All right, Chloe, you got me with the arachnophobia, but still amateur hour. His confidence was infuriating. We needed to step it up. We reached the ballroom. It was vast, with a collapsed ceiling in one corner revealing the skeletal ribs of the roof. Moonlight poured through the gaping hole, illuminating a grand, decaying staircase that spiraled upwards into impenetrable darkness. This was it. Okay, guys, positions, I whispered. Ben ducked behind a broken piano, ready with the sound effects. Chloe set up the fog machine near the far wall. I slipped behind a tattered curtain, pulling the white sheet over my head, ready to emerge when Ben gave the signal. Ethan stood in the center of the room, shining his flashlight around. So, this is the grand finale? Where's the big scary ghost? Ben pressed play. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the high walls. It was loud, piercing, designed to send shivers down your spine. But as it faded, something else happened. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that wasn't part of our recording. It felt like the very foundations of the house were vibrating with a deep, malevolent energy. Whoa, what was that? Ethan asked, his voice losing its bravado. Just the bass, Ben stammered, fumbling with his phone. Must be the old house amplifying it. Then the fog machine sputtered to life, but instead of a gentle mist, a thick, acrid cloud billowed out, smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic. It wasn't the sweet, artificial fog we were used to. It stung my eyes and made my throat itch. Chloe, what did you do? I hissed from behind the curtain. I didn't do anything, she choked, waving her hands in front of her face. It just went crazy. The hum intensified, and the air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. The moonlight streaming through the ceiling holes seemed to dim, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. This wasn't part of the prank. Suddenly, a floorboard directly behind Ethan creaked loudly. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the swirling fog. Nothing. All right, guys, this isn't funny anymore, Ethan said, his voice tight with genuine fear. Cut it out. But we hadn't done anything. Then, a whisper, clear as a bell, slithered through the air, right next to Ethan's ear. It wasn't Ben's voice. It was a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper on bone. Get out, Ethan screamed, a real, terrified scream. He stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, and fell to the floor, his flashlight clattering away and rolling into the shadows. Ethan! I yelled, throwing off the sheet. This was too far. This was real. The hum became a low thrum, vibrating through my teeth. The air was thick with the scent of decay. From the darkness at the top of the grand staircase, a faint, flickering light appeared. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a pale, phosphorescent glow, like foxfire, slowly descending. Run! Ben shrieked, scrambling out from behind the piano. We didn't need to be told twice. Chloe was already bolting for the front door, her panicked gasps echoing. Ethan, still on the floor, was trying to crawl away, his eyes wide with terror fixed on the descending light. I ran to him, grabbing his arm. Come on, Ethan. Get up. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. His eyes were fixed on the light, which was now halfway down the stairs. It wasn't just a light. It was coalescing, forming a vague, humanoid shape within its glow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to shimmer with an internal, malevolent energy. It's them, Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. The Ashworths. I dragged him, pulling him to his feet. We stumbled towards the front door, Chloe's terrified screams guiding us. But as we reached the entrance, the heavy oak door slammed shut with a thunderous boom that shook the entire house. Chloe cried out, pounding on the door. It's locked! It's locked! Panic, cold and sharp, seized my heart. We were trapped. The hum intensified, filling the house, pressing in on us. The air grew even colder, and the metallic, sweet scent became overpowering, making me gag. The phosphorescent figure was now at the bottom of the stairs, its form clearer, though still indistinct, like looking through rippling water. It was tall, gaunt, with long skeletal limbs that seemed to stretch and distort in the flickering light. 2 pinpricks of crimson glowed where its eyes should be. We need to find another way out, Ben yelled, his voice cracking. He ran towards a window, but as his hand touched the glass, a spiderweb crack appeared, spreading rapidly across the pane. He recoiled as if burned. The figure began to glide towards us, not walking, but floating, its movements unnaturally smooth. The air around it shimmered. Upstairs. Ethan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the grand staircase. Maybe there's a back exit. It was a desperate gamble, but our only option. We scrambled up the decaying stairs, the wood groaning ominously under our weight. The phosphorescent figure followed, its silent ascent more terrifying than any footsteps. We reached the landing. Several doors branched off into the darkness. We chose one at random, bursting into what looked like an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with moldering tomes. A heavy, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, covered in dust. This way. Ben pointed to another door at the back of the study. We rushed towards it, but as we reached it, the doorknob twisted violently from the inside, and the door slammed shut. A low, guttural laugh, dry and brittle, echoed from the shadows behind the desk. It wasn't the figure. It was something else, something unseen. What was that? Chloe whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. The phosphorescent figure appeared in the doorway we had just entered, blocking our escape, his crimson eyes fixed on us. You came to play, the dry voice whispered, seeming to emanate from all around us, from the very walls of the house. Now you stay. Suddenly, the books on the shelves began to fly off, hurtling towards us like projectiles. We ducked, shielding our heads. One hit Ben squarely in the temple. He cried out, stumbling backward and collapsing against the wall, a trickle of blood appearing on his forehead. Ben! I yelled, rushing to him. He was dazed, his eyes unfocused. The phosphorescent figure raised a skeletal arm, pointing a long, glowing finger at Ethan. The air around Ethan shimmered, and he let out a choked gasp, clutching his throat. His face turned purple, his hands scrabbling at his neck as if an invisible noose was tightening around him. No! I screamed, trying to reach him, but the air between us felt like a solid wall. Ethan's eyes bulged, his body convulsing. He fell to his knees, still gasping, and then, with a final, desperate wheeze, he went limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The phosphorescent figure lowered its arm. Ethan was dead. Chloe let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. She scrambled away from the figure, tearing at her hair. No, not Ethan. Please, no. The dry, brittle laugh filled the room again. 1 down, 2 to go. The figure began to advance on Chloe. She backed away, stumbling over furniture, her eyes wide with terror. I was frozen, watching in horror, my mind unable to process what was happening. This wasn't a prank. This was real. Ethan was dead. Chloe, run. I finally managed to scream, my voice hoarse. She turned, blindly searching for an escape, and her eyes landed on a large, ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Its pendulum swung slowly, silently. Without thinking, she darted towards it, trying to hide behind it. The phosphorescent figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. Chloe's scream was cut short, a gurgling sound. I saw a flash of glowing light, and then the figure was standing over the grandfather clock, its form shimmering. Chloe was gone, vanished. There was only a faint, lingering scent of ozone and blood. I was alone with Ben, who was still slumped against the wall, barely conscious. The figure turned its glowing crimson eyes on me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Couldn't fight. I was just a girl, armed with nothing but a useless flashlight and a backpack full of discarded prank props. The dry, brittle voice whispered directly into my mind, chilling me to the bone. You disturbed our rest. You mocked our pain. Now you will join us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. The cold intensified, pressing in on me, suffocating. I could feel the malevolent presence drawing closer, its icy touch already on my skin. But then, a faint sound broke through the oppressive silence. A distant siren. The phosphorescent figure paused. Its form flickered, becoming less distinct. The hum in the house began to recede, fading into a low drone. The cold lessened, replaced by the stale, musty air I had first encountered. They come, the dry voice hissed, filled with a sudden, chilling fury. But we will wait. You will return. And then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, the figure vanished. The room was plunged back into relative darkness, illuminated only by the weak beam of my flashlight, which had rolled to a stop near Ethan's still form. The sirens grew louder, closer. I stumbled towards Ben, shaking him. Ben, wake up. We have to go. He groaned, slowly opening his eyes. He looked at Ethan, then at the empty space where Chloe had been, and a fresh wave of horror washed over his face. Sarah, what happened? We have to get out of here, I whispered, pulling him to his feet. We stumbled out of the study, down the grand staircase, and to the front door. It was still closed, but the lock was gone, splintered wood around the frame. I pushed it open, and we burst out into the night, gasping for breath. The cold night air a welcome shock against my burning lungs. The flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance were visible at the end of the long, winding driveway. Someone must have heard Chloe's screams, or perhaps a neighbor had finally called about the commotion. We ran towards them, screaming, crying, incoherent with terror and grief. The police found Ethan's body inside. They found no trace of Chloe. They found no evidence of any figure or supernatural activity. They attributed Ethan's death to a sudden, fatal heart attack, likely brought on by extreme fright, and Chloe's disappearance to a panicked flight into the woods, where she presumably got lost. They searched for days, but Chloe was never found. Ben and I told our story, but no one believed us. How could they? It sounded like the ravings of two traumatized teenagers. We were questioned, examined, and eventually released, haunted by what we had witnessed. Ashworth Estate still stands, a silent sentinel on the hill. The locals still whisper about it, but now, when I hear those whispers, I know they are true. I see Ethan's lifeless eyes, Chloe's terrified face, and I hear that dry, brittle laugh echoing in the silence of my nightmares. We went to Ashworth Estate for a prank. We left with a chilling truth. Some places are best left undisturbed, and some silences should never be broken, because sometimes when you play with fear, fear plays back, and it doesn't play fair. The air in Darklog Creek always hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that clung to everything, especially the old, forgotten places. For Ethan, the scent was synonymous with fear. It was the smell of the woods that bordered the school, the woods where Mark and his pack often cornered him. Mark was a force of nature, a hurricane of muscle and malice. His eyes, the color of muddy river water, held a glint of cruel amusement whenever they landed on Ethan. Ethan, thin and pale, with eyes that always seemed to be searching for an escape route, was Mark's favorite target. Not because Ethan fought back. He never did. But because his fear was a tangible thing, a delicious aroma that Mark savored. It had started subtly in middle school. Tripped in the hallway, books scattered, a sarcastic remark about his worn clothes. By high school, it had escalated. Lunch money vanished, assignments were ruined, and the daily gauntlet of the school hallways became a terrifying ordeal. Mark, flanked by his two loyal, equally brutish lieutenants, Gary and Vince, ruled the social ecosystem of Darklog Creek High. Ethan's sanctuary was the old library, a dusty tomb filled with forgotten histories and whispered secrets. He spent every spare moment there, poring over ancient texts, particularly those about local folklore. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, a woman who looked as if she'd been carved from the very wood of the shelves, often found him there, lost in tales of the Darklog witches and the Whispering Woods, the very woods that tormented him. One frigid autumn afternoon, the bullying reached a new low. Mark had cornered Ethan behind the gym, a place usually deserted. This time, it wasn't just a shove or a stolen lunch. Mark held a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift Ethan had made for his ailing grandmother. "What's this, twig boy?" Mark sneered, twirling the bird by its delicate tail. "A little birdie for your little birdie brain?" Ethan's breath hitched. "Please, Mark, it's for my grandma." Mark's grin widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. With a sickening snap, he broke the bird in half, then ground the pieces under his heel. "Oops," he drawled, feigning innocence. "Guess your grandma's out of luck." Something in Ethan snapped. Not outwardly, not in a burst of anger, but deep inside, a fragile thread of hope frayed and broke. He stared at the splintered wood, then at Mark's smirking face, and a cold, alien thought settled in his mind. They would pay. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He walked, not to the library, but to the edge of the Whispering Woods, the place he dreaded most. He carried the shattered pieces of the wooden bird. The air grew colder, the trees denser, their branches clawing at the bruised twilight sky. He found a small, overgrown clearing, a place that felt ancient and undisturbed. There, he dug a shallow hole, placed the broken bird inside, and covered it with earth. Then, he whispered words he'd read in an old, forgotten book, words about justice, about echoes, about the woods remembering. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that a desperate, primal urge had driven him there. The next day, a subtle shift began. Started with Mark. During history class, a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the room, making the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. He shivered, blaming the old school's drafty windows. Later, walking home, he swore he heard his name whispered on the wind, a voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He spun around, but no one was there. Gary, Mark's most loyal follower, was next. He woke up one morning to find a small, perfectly carved wooden bird on his pillow. It was identical to the one Mark had destroyed, but this one was whole, its eyes seeming to gleam in the dim morning light. Gary, unnerved, threw it into the trash. The next morning, it was back, nestled neatly on his pillow, its wooden eyes fixed on him. He tossed it out again, but the pattern repeated. By the end of the week, Gary was sleeping with the lights on, convinced the bird was watching him. Vince, the third of the trio, began to experience more unsettling phenomena. Shadows in his peripheral vision seemed to deepen and move, taking on grotesque shapes. He'd be alone in his room, and the temperature would plummet, his breath misting in the air, followed by the faint, rhythmic sound of wood splintering, as if something was being slowly, deliberately broken. He started losing weight, his eyes perpetually wide with fear. Mark, initially dismissive of his friend's growing paranoia, found himself increasingly disturbed. The whispers intensified, sometimes sounding like his own name, sometimes like a low, guttural growl. He started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of a gaunt, shadowy figure at the edge of his vision, always just out of focus, always receding when he tried to look directly. The figure reminded him, chillingly, of Ethan. One night, Mark was alone in his room, trying to study, when the lights flickered and died. A profound, suffocating darkness enveloped him. He fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint scratching began, like nails dragging across wood. It grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like something was trying to claw its way out of the wall. Mark scrambled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, mournful creaking, like an old, heavy door slowly opening. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and pine, the smell of the whispering woods. He fled his house, running blindly through the streets of Darklog Creek, the whispers chasing him, the image of the shadowy figure flickering at the edge of his vision. He ran until he reached the school, its dark silhouette looming against the moonless sky. He burst through the unlocked side door, seeking the false comfort of familiarity, the place where he had always been in control. He found himself in the deserted hallway, the lockers casting long, skeletal shadows. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. Then, from the end of the hallway, a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap began. It was the sound of something being dragged, something hard and unyielding, across the tiled floor. Mark's breath hitched. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. A shape emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, dragging something behind it. As it drew closer, the tap-tap-tap grew louder, more distinct. It was Ethan, but not Ethan as Mark knew him. This Ethan was taller, his limbs elongated, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones. His eyes, usually downcast, were now wide and luminous, glowing with an unnatural, cold light. And what he dragged behind him was a large, gnarled branch, from which hung dozens, hundreds, of intricately carved wooden birds. They swayed gently, their tiny wooden eyes seeming to watch Mark. The air grew frigid, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled the hallway, overwhelming everything. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around Mark, forming words he could almost grasp. Justice. Echoes. Remember. Ethan. Mark's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. The figure stopped, just feet away. The wooden birds on the branch clicked and clacked together like skeletal fingers. Ethan's lips, thin and pale, parted. His voice, when it came, was not his own. It was a chorus of dry leaves, of splintering wood, of 1,000 whispered secrets. You broke what was whole, the voice hissed, echoing in the vast emptiness of the hallway. You took what was given. The woods remember. Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What are you? The glowing eyes fixed on him. We are the echoes of what you destroyed. We are the whispers of the woods, and we have come to collect. The shadowy figures he had glimpsed before now solidified, emerging from the deeper darkness of the hallway. They were gaunt, indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, surrounding Mark. He tried to run, but his legs were leaden. The cold seeped into his bones, a profound, ancient chill that promised to never leave. The wooden birds on Ethan's branch began to spin faster, faster, until they were a blur, their clicking a deafening roar in his ears. The last thing Mark saw was Ethan's face, no longer pale and fearful, but serene, almost peaceful, as the shadows closed in. The glowing eyes were the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him, before the whispers became his own screams, unheard by anyone but the ancient, remembering woods. The next morning, Mark didn't show up for school, nor did Gary or Vince. The town buzzed with rumors, whispers of runaways, of families moving away in the dead of night. No one ever found them. Ethan, however, was back in school. He was still quiet, still spent his time in the library. But there was a subtle change. His eyes, though still reserved, held a new, unreadable depth. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, A faint, almost imperceptible clicking sound could be heard, like tiny wooden birds swaying gently in an unseen breeze. The whispering woods of Darklog Creek had claimed its due, and the echoes of justice lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that some debts are paid in darkness. The air in the closet was thick with the scent of mothballs and forgotten dreams. Arthur huddled amongst the hanging clothes, his knees drawn to his chest. A trembling hand clamped over his mouth to stifle the ragged gasps that threatened to betray him. Outside, the house was a symphony of soft, deliberate sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of fabric, the almost imperceptible drag of something heavy across the carpet. Eleanor. He had been in here for what felt like an eternity, though his watch, when he dared to glance at it in the sliver of light filtering through the crack beneath the door, stubbornly insisted it had only been 27 minutes. 27 minutes since the porcelain vase, a wedding gift from his aunt, had shattered against the wall inches from his head. 27 minutes since Eleanor's eyes, usually a placid blue, had hardened into chips of ice, reflecting a madness he'd only ever glimpsed in the darkest corners of his nightmares. It had started subtly, as these things often do, a misplaced set of keys escalating into a furious accusation of sabotage, a burnt dinner leading to a week of silent, simmering resentment. Then the whispers, at first barely audible, then growing louder, directed at unseen figures in the corners of rooms. He tried to talk to her, to suggest help, but each attempt was met with a chilling smile and a dismissive wave of her hand. "You worry too much, Arthur. It's just stress." But it wasn't stress. It was a creeping, insidious decay of her mind, and he, foolishly, had stayed, hoping to weather the storm, to find the Eleanor he loved buried beneath the layers of delusion. He should have left weeks ago, months ago, when the first shard of doubt pierced his heart. Now he was trapped. A soft thud echoed from the bedroom. He flinched, pressing himself further into the musty embrace of his winter coats. It sounded like a book falling, or perhaps something heavier. Was she searching? What was she looking for? Him, most likely, or perhaps something to use. He remembered the glint of the carving knife from dinner, how she'd held it just a moment too long, her gaze distant, unfocused. He'd dismissed it then, a trick of the light, his own overactive imagination. Now the memory was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The floorboards outside the closet creaked again, closer this time. He could almost feel her presence, a suffocating weight on the other side of the thin wooden door. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to regulate his breathing, to slow the frantic drumbeat of his heart. Every inhale felt like a siren, every exhale a betraying sigh. "Arthur!" Her voice, when it came, was a soft, melodic hum, utterly devoid of the rage that had just moments ago contorted her features. It was the voice she used when she wanted something, when she was trying to lure him into a false sense of security. It was the voice that now terrified him more than any scream. "Are you playing hide and seek, darling?" He remained motionless, a statue carved from fear. He could feel the dust motes dancing in the faint light, each one a tiny, silent witness to his terror. The air grew heavier, colder, as if her madness had seeped into the very atmosphere of the room. "You know I don't like it when you hide," she continued, her voice still sweet, but with an underlying current of something sharp, like a razor's edge. He heard the rustle of clothing, the clink of hangers. She was in the closet, just not his side of it. The master bedroom had two large, walk-in closets, one for him, one for her, separated by a thin wall of drywall and a shared sense of dread. He heard her humming now, a nursery rhyme, off-key and distorted. It was a lullaby she used to sing to herself when she was stressed, a habit he'd once found endearing. Now it was a prelude to something terrible. A sudden, sharp rap on the wall beside him made him jump, his head hitting the back of the closet with a dull thud. He bit back a cry, his eyes watering. "Found you," she sang, her voice a little louder, a little closer. He knew she hadn't found him. Not yet. She was just playing, toying with him. This was her game, and he was the mouse. He remembered the cat she'd had as a child, a cruel tabby that would catch birds and play with them. batting them around, before finally delivering the killing blow. Eleanor had watched, fascinated, her small face devoid of emotion. He'd dismissed it then as childish curiosity. Now he saw the pattern. He heard her footsteps move away from the shared wall, towards the main door of the bedroom. A click, then the soft groan of the door opening. Was she leaving? Was it over? His hopes soared, then plummeted. She wouldn't leave. Not yet. She enjoyed this too much. He heard her talking now, her voice muffled, as if to someone else. He's being naughty, you see. He doesn't want to come out and play. Play? What did she mean by play? His mind raced, cataloging every unsettling incident, every strange comment. The way she'd meticulously cleaned the antique silver last week, polishing each piece until it gleamed, then arranging them in a perfect, unsettling circle on the dining table. The way she'd stared at him during dinner, her fork poised midair, a faint, unreadable smile playing on her lips. A sudden, jarring crash from downstairs. He almost cried out. It sounded like a heavy piece of furniture had been overturned. What was she doing? Was she destroying the house? Or was it a distraction? He waited, listening, his ears straining against the silence that followed the crash. The humming started again, closer this time, accompanied by the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of something hard against the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, each tap echoing in the claustrophobic space of the closet, a morbid countdown. He imagined her, walking slowly, methodically, around the room, tapping whatever object she held. A cane? A hammer? The carving knife? His imagination, fueled by terror, supplied 1,000 gruesome possibilities. The tapping stopped directly outside his closet door. His breath hitched. He could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. She was there, right there. Arthur, she whispered, her voice barely audible through the wood, yet it resonated in his bones. I know you're in there. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to become one with the coats, to disappear into the shadows. He wished he could stop breathing, stop existing, just for a moment, until she passed. It's not fair, you know, she continued, her voice taking on a wounded, childlike quality. You always hide from me, and I just want to talk. Talk? He scoffed internally. Talk meant accusations, threats, perhaps even violence. He remembered the bruise on his arm, a fading purple, from when she'd accidentally slammed the kitchen door on him, or the time she'd slipped and pushed him down the stairs. Each incident had been carefully framed as an accident, her eyes wide and innocent, her apologies saccharine sweet. A faint scratching sound. He tensed. Was she trying to pry open the door? He heard a soft sniffle, then a sob. Was she crying? Was this another one of her tricks? He knew her tears were often more dangerous than her rage. They disarmed him, made him drop his guard, only for her to strike when he was vulnerable. I just want to tell you something, Arthur, she whimpered, her voice thick with feigned sorrow. Something important. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was a dry, constricted tunnel. I found it, she said, her voice suddenly clear, devoid of the earlier sadness. A chilling note of triumph laced her words. The key. His blood ran cold. The key. What key? The spare key to the house? The key to his study? Or the key to the closet door? He hadn't even known there was a key to the closet. It had always been unlocked. A metallic click. His heart leaped into his throat, pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He heard the faint jingle of keys, then the scrape of metal against wood. No, this couldn't be happening. The doorknob rattled, then slowly, agonizingly, began to turn. He scrambled backward, deeper into the closet, his hands flailing, knocking against the rough fabric of his suits. He wanted to scream, to kick, to fight, but his body was paralyzed by a primal terror. The door creaked open, just a crack at first, then wider. A sliver of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the dust motes in a terrifying dance. He could see the edge of her floral dressing gown, the delicate lace trim. Peek-a-boo, she whispered, her voice a sing-song, childlike tone that sent shivers down his spine. He squeezed his eyes shut again, bracing himself for the inevitable. He could feel the cold draft from the open door, the sudden rush of air, then silence. He waited, his muscles screaming, his breath held captive in his lungs. Had she gone? Was this another cruel trick? He slowly, cautiously opened one eye. The door was still open, a narrow gap, but she wasn't there. He heard her footsteps receding, moving away from the closet, towards the bed. He heard the soft rustle of sheets, the creak of the mattress. Was she getting into bed? Was it over? Had she forgotten him? He risked opening both eyes. The closet was still dark, but the sliver of light from the bedroom was gone. The door was closed, not latched, not locked, just closed. He let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was safe, for now. He waited, listening intently. The house was utterly silent now, save for the frantic thumping of his own heart. He slowly, painstakingly, began to unfold himself from his cramped position, his limbs stiff and protesting. He reached out a trembling hand and pushed gently against the closet door. It opened with a soft sigh. The bedroom was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. He could see the outline of the bed, the rumpled sheets. Eleanor was there, lying perfectly still, facing away from him, her back to the door. She seemed to be asleep. He crept out of the closet, moving with agonizing slowness, each step a calculated risk. He needed to get out of the room, out of the house, out of her reach. He tiptoed towards the bedroom door, his eyes fixed on Eleanor's still form. He was almost there, just a few more steps. As he reached for the doorknob, a soft voice broke the silence, sending a fresh wave of terror through him. "You know, Arthur," she said, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of sleepiness. "I never liked that vase anyway." He froze, his hand inches from the knob. He didn't dare turn around. "It was so ordinary," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "Not like us, is it? We're special. Unique." He could hear her shifting in the bed, the rustle of sheets. Was she getting up? "But you," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper. "You're my favorite toy." He heard the distinct click of a lighter. A faint orange glow illuminated the room for a split second, revealing Eleanor, sitting up in bed, a small, knowing smile on her face. In her hand, she held not a lighter, but a small, silver-plated pistol. The same one his father had kept in his study, the one he'd taught Arthur to shoot with years ago. The one he'd thought was safely locked away. "And I don't like it when my toys run away," she said, her smile widening, her eyes glinting in the faint light. He didn't wait. He threw open the door and bolted, down the stairs, towards the front door, the sound of her laughter echoing behind him, a chilling melody of madness and despair. He didn't know if he would make it, but he knew one thing. He would never, ever hide in a closet again.